In the mists of time, where crowns are won not by birthright but by will, there lived a woman whose name would echo through the halls of history like thunder across the Russian steppes. She was born beneath foreign stars, yet destiny would crown her Empress of all the Russias. In palaces where shadows danced with candlelight, where whispered secrets could topple kingdoms, where love and power intertwined like silk and steel, her story unfolds. Listen now to the tale of Catherine, called the Great, whose heart beat with the rhythm of empires, whose mind blazed brighter than the northern lights, whose legacy carved itself deep into the soul of a nation. From the gentle hills of Germany to the frozen grandeur of St. Petersburg, from princess to empress, from mortal woman to legend immortal, this is her story, told in the language of dreams and time. If this journey into history moves you, take a moment to like, share, and subscribe. Let timeless stories find new hearts, just like yours. In the year 1729, when the world still moved to the rhythm of horses' hooves and the turning of seasons marked the passage of empires, a child was born in the small German principality of Anhalt-Zerbst. The town of Stettin lay wrapped in morning mist, its cobblestone streets still glistening with dew, when Sophie Friederike August entered the world on May the 2nd. The bells of the local church rang out across the countryside, though none who heard them could have imagined they were announcing the birth of one who would become the most powerful woman in Europe. Her father, Christian August, Prince of Anhalt-Zerbst-Dornburg, was a man of modest means but noble blood. He served as a Prussian general, his days spent in the disciplined world of military service, his evenings in the quiet comfort of family life. Her mother, Johanna Elisabeth of Holstein-Gottorp, carried within her veins the complex bloodlines of Northern European nobility, connections that would prove far more valuable than gold in the chess game of royal marriages that lay ahead. The castle where young Sophie spent her earliest years was neither grand nor imposing by the standards of great European courts. Its rooms were comfortable but simple, its gardens well tended but modest in scope. Yet within these humble walls, a mind was taking shape that would one day command the vast expanses of Russia, from the Baltic shores to the shores of the Black Sea, from the Polish borders to the distant mountains of Siberia. Sophie was a child of remarkable intelligence and curious spirit. While other noble children of her age played with dolls and learned the simple arts of needlework, she found herself drawn to books, to maps, to the stories her tutors told of distant lands and ancient empires. Her parents soon recognized that their daughter possessed an unusual mind, quick to learn, eager to question, and blessed with a memory that seemed to capture and hold every detail of her lessons. The young princess's education was entrusted to a French governess, Mademoiselle Cardel, a woman of intelligence and broad learning who would prove instrumental in shaping Sophie's worldview. Under her guidance, Sophie mastered French, the language of European diplomacy and culture, and began her study of history, philosophy, and literature. French became as natural to her as German, and through the great works of Corneille, Racine, and Molière, she began to understand the power of language, the beauty of rhetoric, and the complex dance of human emotions that played out in the courts of kings. But it was not only books that educated the young princess. The world itself was her classroom, and she learned to observe the intricate social patterns that governed noble society. She watched how her mother navigated the complex relationships between family members, how alliances were formed and dissolved over dinner conversations, how a glance or a carefully chosen word could convey messages that changed the course of important decisions. In the evenings, when the castle grew quiet and shadows lengthened across the stone floors, Sophie would often find herself at her window, gazing out at the star-filled sky and wondering about the vast world that lay beyond the borders of her small principality. She dreamed of great cities she had never seen, of courts where history was made, of the responsibility and power that came with ruling over millions of people. These were not the usual dreams of a young noble girl, but Sophie was far from usual. Her father, observing his daughter's exceptional qualities, began to speak with her about matters of state and governance. He told her stories of military campaigns, of the strategies that won battles, and the diplomacy that won peace. He explained the delicate balance of power that existed between the various German states, the complex web of alliances that kept Europe from descending into constant warfare, and the importance of understanding not just one's enemies, but one's friends as well. As Sophie grew older, her reputation for intelligence and charm began to spread beyond the borders of Anhalt-Zerbst. Visitors to the castle would comment on the remarkable young princess who could converse knowledgeably about philosophy, who displayed genuine interest in the political affairs of neighboring states, and who carried herself with a dignity that seemed far beyond her years. Word of her exceptional qualities began to reach the ears of those who arranged the marriages of royal families, those who understood that a princess of extraordinary ability might prove valuable in the complex game of European dynastic politics. Meanwhile, far to the east, in the glittering capital of St. Petersburg, another drama was unfolding. Empress Elizabeth of Russia, having secured her throne through a palace coup in 1741, found herself facing the challenge that had plagued Russian rulers for generations, the need to secure the succession. Her nephew, the young Grand Duke Peter, was heir to the throne, but he remained unmarried. The Empress knew that the choice of Peter's bride would be one of the most important decisions of her reign, affecting not only the future of the Romanov dynasty but the balance of power across all of Europe. Elizabeth's advisors presented her with numerous possibilities. They spoke of French princesses and Austrian archduchesses, of the political advantages that would come with various alliances. But Elizabeth, a woman of shrewd political instincts, understood that she needed more than just a beautiful face or an advantageous connection. She needed a princess who could adapt to the unique challenges of Russian court life, who possessed the intelligence to navigate the complex political currents of St. Petersburg, and who might one day prove worthy of wearing the crown of the Tsars. It was in this context that the name of Sophie of Anhalt-Zerbst first came to Elizabeth's attention. The recommendation came through complex family connections. Sophie's mother was related to the Holstein-Gottorp family, which had its own claims to the Russian throne. But more importantly, reports spoke of Sophie's exceptional character, her quick mind, and her remarkable adaptability. Elizabeth, intrigued by these accounts, began to consider the possibility of inviting the young German princess to Russia. The invitation, when it finally came, arrived like a bolt of lightning on a clear day. It was the winter of 1744, and Sophie had just celebrated her 14th birthday when a mysterious message reached the court of Anhalt-Zerbst. The letter bore the seal of Empress Elizabeth of Russia and contained an invitation that would change the course of Sophie's life forever. She and her mother were invited to visit St. Petersburg, ostensibly for the Empress to meet the young princess and assess her suitability as a bride for the Grand Duke Peter. The preparations for the journey began immediately. For weeks the castle bustled with activity as seamstresses worked to create appropriate court dress, as tutors provided intensive lessons in Russian history and customs, and as the family prepared for what they all understood might be a permanent farewell. Sophie approached these preparations with a mixture of excitement and apprehension. She understood that she was being considered for one of the most important marriages in Europe, but she also realized that accepting such a position would mean leaving behind everything familiar and embarking on a life in a foreign land whose language she did not speak and whose customs she barely understood. The journey to Russia was long and arduous. Traveling by carriage across the frozen landscapes of northern Europe in winter was an ordeal that tested both physical endurance and emotional resolve. Sophie and her mother, accompanied by a small retinue of servants and guards, made their way slowly eastward through Poland and into the vast expanses of the Russian Empire. With each passing mile, the landscape became more foreign, the architecture more exotic, and the sense of entering a different world more pronounced. Sophie used the long hours of travel to prepare herself mentally for what lay ahead. She practiced the few Russian phrases she had learned, reviewed everything she had been taught about Russian history and court protocol, and tried to imagine what her life might become if the Empress approved of her as a bride for Peter. But perhaps most importantly, she made a fundamental decision about how she would approach this opportunity. Rather than viewing herself as a German princess who happened to be visiting Russia, she began the process of transforming herself into someone who could become truly Russian. When their carriage finally approached the outskirts of St. Petersburg, in February 1744, Sophie got her first glimpse of the magnificent city that Peter the Great had built as his window to Europe. The sight that greeted her was unlike anything she had ever seen. Here was a city that seemed to have been conjured from dreams. Vast palaces rising from frozen canals, church domes that glittered like gold in the winter sun, broad avenues that spoke of imperial ambition on a scale that dwarfed anything in Germany. St. Petersburg in the 1740s was still a relatively young city, barely 4 decades old, but it had already established itself as one of the great capitals of Europe. The architecture blended European styles with Russian traditions, creating something entirely unique. The Winter Palace, still under construction, promised to be one of the largest and most magnificent royal residences in the world. The Nevsky Prospect stretched out like a grand boulevard through the heart of the city, lined with the palaces of the nobility and the embassies of foreign powers. Sophie and her mother were housed in comfortable apartments within the palace complex, and almost immediately, the young princess began her introduction to Russian court life. The court of Empress Elizabeth was a world of extraordinary luxury and complexity. Hundreds of nobles, courtiers, diplomats, and servants moved through the palace halls in an intricate dance of ceremony and politics. Every conversation might contain hidden meanings. Every social gathering might affect the balance of power, and every individual's position in the elaborate hierarchy was constantly being measured and adjusted. The Empress herself was a formidable figure. Elizabeth Petrovna, daughter of Peter the Great, had inherited both her father's intelligence and his determination. She had seized the throne through a military coup 3 years earlier, demonstrating that she possessed not only royal blood, but the courage and political skill necessary to claim and hold power. When Sophie was finally presented to the Empress, she found herself face to face with a woman of commanding presence, sharp eyes that seemed to see everything, and a manner that was both gracious and calculating. The meeting between Elizabeth and Sophie was carefully orchestrated, but its outcome would depend entirely on the impression the young German princess made. Sophie had prepared for this moment throughout her journey, and she understood that her entire future hung in the balance. She curtsied with perfect grace, spoke her carefully practiced Russian phrases with confidence, and answered the Empress's questions with a combination of humility and intelligence that clearly impressed her imperial host. But Elizabeth was far too experienced to make such an important decision based on a single meeting. Over the following weeks, Sophie found herself constantly under observation. She attended court ceremonies, participated in social gatherings, and was introduced to the complex world of Russian Orthodox Christianity. Every aspect of her behavior was noted and analyzed, from the way she handled herself during formal presentations to how she interacted with other members of the court during informal conversations. Meanwhile, Sophie was also meeting her prospective bridegroom, Grand Duke Peter. Peter was a young man of complex character, intelligent but often petulant, capable of charm but also prone to childish outbursts. He had been raised primarily in Germany and spoke Russian poorly, making him something of an outsider in his own future kingdom. Sophie quickly realized that Peter's relationship with Russia was complicated, and that if she were to marry him, she would need to find ways to bridge the gap between his German upbringing and his Russian destiny. The more time Sophie spent in St. Petersburg, the more she realized that her success or failure would depend not just on pleasing the Empress or getting along with Peter, but on her ability to truly understand and embrace Russian culture. She threw herself into this challenge with characteristic determination. She spent hours each day improving her Russian language skills, working with tutors who helped her master not just basic conversation, but the subtle nuances of court speech. She studied Russian history with the same intensity she had once brought to her French lessons, learning about the great rulers who had shaped the nation, the military victories that had expanded its borders, and the cultural traditions that gave Russian society its unique character. As spring arrived in St. Petersburg, bringing with it the spectacular white nights that made the city seem even more magical, Sophie's position at court became increasingly secure. The Empress had clearly been impressed by the young princess's intelligence and adaptability. But more importantly, Sophie had begun to demonstrate something that Elizabeth valued even more highly: a genuine love for Russia itself. This love was not manufactured or diplomatic. It was real and growing stronger each day. Sophie found herself genuinely fascinated by Russian culture, moved by the depth of religious feeling she encountered in Orthodox ceremonies, and inspired by the scope of the imperial vision that had created this magnificent capital. She began to understand that Russia was not just another European kingdom, but a unique civilization that bridged East and West, a nation with its own destiny and its own ways of understanding the world. The decision to formally convert to Russian Orthodoxy was perhaps the most significant step in Sophie's transformation. This was not merely a political necessity, but a spiritual journey that she undertook with complete sincerity. She studied with Orthodox priests, learning the theological differences between the Russian Church and the Protestant faith of her upbringing. She participated in Orthodox services, finding in their ancient rituals and haunting music something that spoke to her soul in ways she had never experienced before. On June 28, 1744, in a ceremony of great solemnity and beauty, Sophie officially converted to Russian Orthodoxy and took the name Ekaterina Alexeyevna, Catherine. The choice of name was deeply significant, honoring both Saint Catherine of Alexandria and Catherine I, Peter the Great's beloved wife, who had herself been a foreign-born woman who became fully Russian. The ceremony took place in the palace chapel, with the Empress herself serving as Catherine's godmother, symbolically welcoming her into not just the Orthodox faith, but into the Russian imperial family. The following day brought an even more momentous event: Catherine's official betrothal to Grand Duke Peter. The engagement ceremony was a magnificent affair, attended by the highest nobility of Russia and representatives from courts across Europe. Catherine, resplendent in Russian court dress and sparkling with diamonds that caught the light of 1,000 candles, stood beside Peter as they exchanged rings and pledged their troth according to Russian custom. But even as she participated in these grand ceremonies, Catherine was already beginning to understand the complex challenges that lay ahead. Her relationship with Peter was cordial but not passionate, built more on mutual respect than on romantic love. Peter appreciated Catherine's intelligence and her ability to converse on topics that interested him, but he remained somewhat distant, still more comfortable speaking German than Russian, and often seeming more interested in military drilling and toy soldiers than in the serious business of preparing to rule an empire. Catherine, however, was already thinking far beyond the immediate circumstances of her engagement. She had begun to develop her own vision of what Russia could become and what role she might play in that future. She spent long hours in the palace library, reading the works of European philosophers, studying the histories of great rulers, and developing her understanding of the principles of enlightened governance. She was particularly drawn to the writings of Voltaire and other French philosophers, whose ideas about reason, justice, and progress seemed to offer a framework for understanding how a monarch might rule for the benefit of all people, rather than merely for the privileged few. Sophie used the long hours of travel to prepare herself mentally for what lay ahead. She practiced the few Russian phrases she had learned, reviewed everything she had been taught about Russian history and court protocol, and tried to imagine what her life might become if the Empress approved of her as a bride for Peter. But, perhaps most importantly, she made a fundamental decision about how she would approach this opportunity. Rather than viewing herself as a German princess who happened to be visiting Russia, she began the process of transforming herself into someone who could become truly Russian. When their carriage finally approached the outskirts of St. Petersburg in February 1744, Sophie got her first glimpse of the magnificent city that Peter the Great had built as his window to Europe. The sight that greeted her was unlike anything she had ever seen. Here was a city that seemed to have been conjured from dreams, vast palaces rising from frozen canals, church domes that glittered like gold in the winter sun, broad avenues that spoke of imperial ambition on a scale that dwarfed anything in Germany. St. Petersburg in the 1740s was still a relatively young city, barely 4 decades old, but it had already established itself as one of the great capitals of Europe. The architecture blended European styles with Russian traditions, creating something entirely unique. The Winter Palace, still under construction, promised to be one of the largest and most magnificent royal residences in the world. The Nevsky Prospect stretched out like a grand boulevard through the heart of the city, lined with the palaces of the nobility and the embassies of foreign powers. Sophie and her mother were housed in comfortable apartments within the palace complex, and almost immediately the young princess began her introduction to Russian court life. The court of Empress Elizabeth was a world of extraordinary luxury and complexity. Hundreds of nobles, courtiers, diplomats, and servants moved through the palace halls in an intricate dance of ceremony and politics. Every conversation might contain hidden meanings. Every social gathering might affect the balance of power. And every individual's position in the elaborate hierarchy was constantly being measured and adjusted. The Empress herself was a formidable figure. Elizabeth Petrovna, daughter of Peter the Great, had inherited both her father's intelligence and his determination. She had seized the throne through a military coup 3 years earlier, demonstrating that she possessed not only royal blood, but the courage and political skill necessary to claim and hold power. When Sophie was finally presented to the Empress, she found herself face to face with a woman of commanding presence, sharp eyes that seemed to see everything, and a manner that was both gracious and calculating. The meeting between Elizabeth and Sophie was carefully orchestrated, but its outcome would depend entirely on the impression the young German princess made. Sophie had prepared for this moment throughout her journey, and she understood that her entire future hung in the balance. She curtsied with perfect grace, spoke her carefully practiced Russian phrases with confidence, and answered the Empress's questions with a combination of humility and intelligence that clearly impressed her imperial host. But Elizabeth was far too experienced to make such an important decision based on a single meeting. Over the following weeks, Sophie found herself constantly under observation. She attended court ceremonies, participated in social gatherings, and was introduced to the complex world of Russian Orthodox Christianity. Every aspect of her behavior was noted and analyzed, from the way she handled herself during formal presentations to how she interacted with other members of the court during informal conversations. Meanwhile, Sophie was also meeting her prospective bridegroom, Grand Duke Peter. Peter was a young man of complex character, intelligent but often petulant, capable of charm but also prone to childish outbursts. He had been raised primarily in Germany and spoke Russian poorly, making him something of an outsider in his own future kingdom. Sophie quickly realized that Peter's relationship with Russia was complicated, and that if she were to marry him, she would need to find ways to bridge the gap between his German upbringing and his Russian destiny. The more time Sophie spent in St. Petersburg, the more she realized that her success or failure would depend not just on pleasing the Empress or getting along with Peter, but on her ability to truly understand and embrace Russian culture. She threw herself into this challenge with characteristic determination. She spent hours each day improving her Russian language skills, working with tutors who helped her master not just basic conversation, but the subtle nuances of court speech. She studied Russian history with the same intensity she had once brought to her French lessons, learning about the great rulers who had shaped the nation, the military victories that had expanded its borders, and the cultural traditions that gave Russian society its unique character. As spring arrived in St. Petersburg, bringing with it the spectacular white nights that made the city seem even more magical, Sophie's position at court became increasingly secure. The Empress had clearly been impressed by the young princess's intelligence and adaptability, but more importantly, Sophie had begun to demonstrate something that Elizabeth valued even more highly: a genuine love for Russia itself. This love was not manufactured or diplomatic. It was real and growing stronger each day. Sophie found herself genuinely fascinated by Russian culture, moved by the depth of religious feeling she encountered in Orthodox ceremonies, and inspired by the scope of the imperial vision that had created this magnificent capital. She began to understand that Russia was not just another European kingdom, but a unique civilization that bridged East and West, a nation with its own destiny and its own ways of understanding the world. The decision to formally convert to Russian Orthodoxy was perhaps the most significant step in Sophie's transformation. This was not merely a political necessity, but a spiritual journey that she undertook with complete sincerity. She studied with Orthodox priests, learning the theological differences between the Russian Church and the Protestant faith of her upbringing. She participated in Orthodox services, finding in their ancient rituals and haunting music something that spoke to her soul in ways she had never experienced before. On June 28, 1744, in a ceremony of great solemnity and beauty, Sophie officially converted to Russian Orthodoxy and took the name Ekaterina Alexeyevna, Catherine. The choice of name was deeply significant, honoring both Saint Catherine of Alexandria and Catherine the Thorns, Peter the Great's beloved wife, who had herself been a foreign-born woman who became fully Russian. The ceremony took place in the palace chapel, with the Empress herself serving as Catherine's godmother, symbolically welcoming her into not just the Orthodox faith, but into the Russian imperial family. The following day brought an even more momentous event: Catherine's official betrothal to Grand Duke Peter. The engagement ceremony was a magnificent affair, attended by the highest nobility of Russia and representatives from courts across Europe. Catherine, resplendent in Russian court dress and sparkling with diamonds that caught the light of 1,000 candles, stood beside Peter as they exchanged rings and pledged their troth according to Russian custom. But even as she participated in these grand ceremonies, Catherine was already beginning to understand the complex challenges that lay ahead. Her relationship with Peter was cordial but not passionate, built more on mutual respect than on romantic love. Peter appreciated Catherine's intelligence and her ability to converse on topics that interested him, but he remained somewhat distant, still more comfortable speaking German than Russian, and often seeming more interested in military drilling and toy soldiers than in the serious business of preparing to rule an empire. Catherine, however, was already thinking far beyond the immediate circumstances of her engagement. She had begun to develop her own vision of what Russia could become and what role she might play in that future. She spent long hours in the palace library, reading the works of European philosophers, studying the histories of great rulers, and developing her understanding of the principles of enlightened governance. She was particularly drawn to the writings of Voltaire and other French philosophers, whose ideas about reason, justice, and progress seemed to offer a framework for understanding how a monarch might rule for the benefit of all people rather than merely for the privileged few. The months between her betrothal and her wedding were a time of intensive preparation and learning. Catherine continued to improve her Russian, reaching the point where she could converse fluently and even write letters in her adopted language. She studied Russian law and administration, learning how the vast empire was governed and beginning to form her own ideas about possible reforms and improvements. She cultivated relationships with important court figures, demonstrating a natural talent for the kind of diplomatic finesse that would serve her well in the complex world of imperial politics. Most importantly, Catherine began to develop the network of relationships and the base of support that would prove crucial to her future success. She understood instinctively that her position as Peter's fiancée was secure only as long as the Empress favored her, and that her long-term success would depend on her ability to win the loyalty and respect of the Russian people themselves. She made a point of learning about Russian customs and traditions, of showing respect for Orthodox religious practices, and of demonstrating through her words and actions that she considered herself to be truly Russian rather than merely a German princess who happened to be living in Russia. The wedding took place on August 23rd, 1745, in a ceremony of unprecedented magnificence. The Cathedral of the Nativity of the Virgin was decorated with thousands of flowers and illuminated by countless candles. Catherine, wearing a gown of silver, tissue embroidered with diamonds and a crown that had belonged to previous Russian empresses, walked down the aisle accompanied by the greatest nobles of the realm, The ceremony itself was conducted according to Orthodox ritual, with ancient prayers sung in Church Slavonic and incense filling the air with its sacred fragrance. As Catherine stood beside Peter, exchanging vows that bound her to him and to Russia forever, she might have reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought her to this moment. Less than 2 years earlier, she had been a relatively obscure German princess, whose future seemed likely to involve marriage to some minor noble and a quiet life managing a small estate. Now she was Grand Duchess of Russia, second only to the Empress herself in rank and precedence, destined one day to share in ruling the largest empire on earth. But Catherine also understood that the wedding ceremony, magnificent as it was, represented only the beginning of her real challenges. Being married to the heir to the Russian throne was very different from actually exercising power, and Catherine had already begun to realize that her husband's temperament and interests might not make him an ideal ruler. She had also observed enough of court life to understand that the transition from one reign to the next was always a time of potential crisis, when alliances shifted, when long-suppressed ambitions emerged, and when the very survival of the dynasty might depend on the wisdom and strength of those who claimed to lead it. The years that followed Catherine's marriage were a time of profound learning and gradual disillusionment. As Grand Duchess, she found herself in a position of great prestige, but limited actual power, the Empress. Elizabeth remained firmly in control of all important decisions, while Peter seemed content to spend his time with military exercises and the collection of toy soldiers rather than preparing himself for the serious responsibilities of rulership that awaited him. Catherine, however, used these years to complete her transformation into a truly Russian ruler-in-waiting. She established herself as a patron of learning and culture, supporting scholars and artists who were working to create a distinctly Russian intellectual tradition. She began an extensive correspondence with the leading philosophers of Europe, most notably Voltaire, who became not just an intellectual influence, but a genuine friend and admirer. Through these exchanges, Catherine developed her understanding of Enlightenment principles and began to formulate her own ideas about how these progressive ideals might be applied to the governance of Russia. The contrast between Catherine's intellectual development and Peter's apparent lack of interest in serious learning became increasingly apparent to court observers. While Catherine read voraciously and engaged in thoughtful discussions about philosophy, law, and governance, Peter seemed to remain fixated on childish pursuits. He played with toy soldiers for hours, held elaborate military parades with his personal guard, and showed little interest in learning about the Russian people he was destined to rule. Perhaps even more troubling, Peter made no secret of his admiration for Frederick the Great of Prussia, Russia's most dangerous enemy. At a time when Russian armies were fighting Prussian forces in the 7 Years' War, Peter's pro-Prussian sympathies were not only politically dangerous, but potentially treasonous. Catherine, meanwhile, had aligned herself completely with Russian interests, supporting the war effort and demonstrating her loyalty to Russian strategic objectives. The personal relationship between Catherine and Peter also grew increasingly strained. Their marriage had never been based on romantic love, but it had begun with mutual respect and affection. Over time, however, their fundamental differences in temperament and interests created a growing distance between them. Peter's behavior became more erratic and childish, while Catherine continued to mature into a woman of extraordinary intellectual sophistication and political awareness. The question of succession became even more complex when Catherine gave birth to a son, Paul, in September 1754. The birth of an heir should have strengthened the dynasty and clarified the line of succession, but instead, it created new uncertainties. The Empress Elizabeth immediately took charge of the infant, removing him from his parents' care and raising him essentially as her own child. This arrangement left Catherine in the peculiar position of being a mother who had no contact with her own son, a situation that she found deeply painful but was powerless to change. During these difficult years, Catherine found solace and intellectual stimulation in her reading and writing. She began to compose various works on political philosophy, including drafts of legal codes and administrative reforms that she believed might improve the governance of Russia. These writings revealed the depth of her thinking about the challenges facing the empire and demonstrated her growing conviction that Russia needed fundamental reforms if it was to realize its full potential. Catherine's political education was also advanced by her careful observation of court intrigue and palace politics. She learned to recognize the signs of shifting alliances, to understand the personal motivations that drove political decisions, and to identify potential allies and enemies among the complex cast of characters who populated the imperial court. She developed a reputation for discretion and good judgment, qualities that made her a trusted confidant for many court figures who were growing increasingly concerned about Peter's fitness to rule. The death of Empress Elizabeth in December 1761 marked the end of an era and the beginning of the most challenging period in Catherine's life. Peter immediately ascended to the throne as Peter III, and his first actions as emperor confirmed the worst fears of those who had doubted his judgment. He immediately began negotiations to end Russia's participation in the 7 Years' War, abandoning the territorial gains that Russian armies had won through years of sacrifice and essentially handing victory to his idol, Frederick the Great. Even more alarmingly, Peter began implementing policies that demonstrated his fundamental misunderstanding of Russian society and his complete lack of sympathy for Russian traditions and values. He attempted to reorganize the Russian army along Prussian lines, imposed Germanic military discipline that was alien to Russian military culture, and showed open contempt for orthodox religious practices. These actions created growing opposition among the military, the nobility, and the church, the three pillars upon which imperial power rested. Catherine found herself in an increasingly impossible position. As the emperor's wife, she was expected to support his policies publicly, but as someone who had genuinely embraced Russian culture and values, she found many of his actions deeply disturbing. More practically, she began to realize that Peter's behavior was creating the conditions for a potential crisis that could threaten the stability of the entire empire. If Peter continued on his current course, he might provoke a rebellion that could destroy the Romanov dynasty and plunge Russia into civil war. It was during this period that Catherine began to consider the possibility that more drastic action might be necessary to save Russia from the consequences of Peter's misrule. She was not naturally inclined to rebellion or revolution, but she had come to love Russia too deeply to stand by passively, while it was damaged by a ruler who seemed determined to ignore the wishes and needs of his people. The idea of deposing Peter and claiming the throne herself was enormously dangerous, but Catherine began to believe that it might be the only way to preserve the empire that she had come to consider her true home. The spring and early summer of 1762 brought a mounting sense of crisis to the Russian court. Peter III's policies had alienated virtually every important constituency in the empire, and Catherine found herself increasingly at the center of discussions about possible alternatives to his rule. These conversations were necessarily conducted in the utmost secrecy, for the consequences of discovery would have been catastrophic for all involved. The military opposition to Peter's reforms was particularly significant because it involved the elite guard regiments that protected the capital and the imperial family. These units had a long tradition of involvement in palace coups and succession crises, and their loyalty was essential to the survival of any Russian ruler. Peter's attempts to impose Prussian military discipline and his obvious preference for foreign advisors had deeply offended the pride and traditions of these elite soldiers. Catherine's position in this developing crisis was both advantageous and extremely dangerous. As the emperor's wife, she had legitimate claims to consideration in any discussion of the succession, but she was also vulnerable to immediate arrest and execution if Peter discovered evidence of her involvement in opposition activities. She, therefore, had to proceed with extraordinary caution, building support while maintaining the pretense of loyal submission to her husband's authority. The key figure in organizing the conspiracy against Peter was Grigory Orlov, a handsome and charismatic officer in the Guards who had become Catherine's lover and closest confidant. Orlov and his brothers had extensive connections throughout the military and were able to gauge the mood of the troops and identify potential supporters for a coup. Through Orlov, Catherine learned that discontent with Peter's rule had reached the point where military action against him might be both possible and successful. The planning for the coup required careful attention to both military and political considerations. It would be necessary to secure the loyalty of the key guard regiments, to neutralize Peter's supporters, and to present Catherine's claim to the throne in a way that would be accepted by the broader Russian population. This last point was particularly important because Catherine was not only a woman claiming imperial power, but a foreign-born woman whose right to rule might be questioned by those who favored a more traditional succession. Catherine's strategy for addressing this challenge demonstrated the political sophistication she had developed during her years at court. Rather than presenting herself simply as Peter's replacement, she framed her claim to power in terms of her dedication to Russian interests and her commitment to reversing the policies that had damaged the empire's prestige and strength. She emphasized her orthodox faith, her fluency in Russian, and her understanding of Russian traditions and values, all qualities that contrasted sharply with Peter's obvious alienation from his own people. The immediate trigger for the coup came in late June 1762, when Peter announced his intention to lead Russian troops in a war against Denmark to recover territories that belonged to his native Holstein. This announcement was the final straw for many who had hoped that Peter might moderate his policies once he became more accustomed to imperial responsibilities. The prospect of Russian soldiers dying in a war fought for the benefit of a German principality rather than for Russian interests convinced even some of Peter's remaining supporters that he had to be removed from power. On July 8, 1762, while Peter was away from the capital at his palace at Oranienbaum, Catherine received word that the time had come to act. The message came from Alexei Orlov, Grigory's brother, who informed her that the Guards regiments were ready to proclaim her empress, and that delay might give Peter's supporters time to organize effective resistance. Catherine realized that this was the moment upon which everything depended: her own fate, the future of her son, and the destiny of Russia itself. In the early morning hours of July 9th, Catherine quietly left her residence at Peterhof and drove to St. Petersburg, where she was met by Orlov and the other conspirators. The scene that followed was one of the most dramatic in Russian history. Catherine, wearing a simple black dress but carrying herself with imperial dignity, appeared before the assembled Guards regiments and asked for their loyalty. The response was immediate and overwhelming. The soldiers acclaimed her as Empress Catherine II and swore to defend her against all enemies. The transformation was so swift and complete that it seemed almost magical. Within hours, the woman who had been Grand Duchess Catherine, wife of the Emperor, had become Empress Catherine II, sovereign ruler of the Russian Empire. The palace that had witnessed so many previous coups and succession crises now saw perhaps the most remarkable of all: the peaceful transfer of power to a foreign-born woman who had won the throne not through inheritance, but through her own political skill and the loyalty she had earned from the Russian people. Peter III, when he learned of these events, found himself powerless to resist. His support had evaporated so completely that he was unable to mount any effective response to Catherine's coup. Within days, he had abdicated the throne and was taken into custody, bringing to an end one of the shortest and most disastrous reigns in Russian history. Catherine's victory was complete, but she understood that claiming the throne was only the beginning of her real challenges. She now faced the enormous task of governing the largest empire on earth, of implementing the reforms she had long contemplated, and of proving that a foreign-born woman could indeed be worthy of the title that Peter the Great had created Emperor of all the Russias. The little German princess who had arrived in St. Petersburg 18 years earlier as a prospective bride had become Catherine the Great, Empress of Russia, and the most powerful woman in the world. Her reign, which would last for 34 years and transform Russia into a truly great power, was about to begin. The stage was now set for one of the most remarkable chapters in the long and complex history of Imperial Russia. A chapter in which Catherine would prove herself not just a successful usurper, but one of the greatest rulers in Russian history. The Golden threads of destiny had woven themselves into an intricate tapestry, and Catherine stood at its center, no longer the uncertain German princess who had arrived in St. Petersburg decades before. The Winter Palace, with its endless corridors of marble and gilt, had become her dominion, a realm where every whispered conversation, every flickering candle, every rustle of silk bore witness to the transformation of an empire. The crown of Russia, heavy with the weight of centuries, now rested upon her auburn hair, and with it came the intoxicating burden of absolute power. In the early morning hours of July the 9th, 1762, as the sun cast long shadows across the Neva River, Catherine had awakened not merely as an empress, but as the embodiment of a new Russia. The palace guards, who had once served Peter III, now bowed their heads in deference to her command, their allegiance as fluid as the tides that lapped against the granite embankments of her capital. The transformation was not merely political, it was alchemical, as if the very air of the palace had changed its composition, charged now with the electricity of revolutionary possibility. The first months of Catherine's reign unfolded like the pages of an illuminated manuscript, each day inscribed with decisions that would echo through the corridors of history. She understood, with the intuition of a master strategist, that power was not simply seized. It was cultivated, nurtured, and reinforced through the delicate orchestration of ceremony, policy, and personal charisma. The Russian court, with its Byzantine complexities and feudal traditions, required a sovereign who could navigate its treacherous currents while simultaneously reshaping them to her will. In the Grand Throne Room, where Peter the Great's vision of European grandeur had been realized in soaring columns and crystal chandeliers, Catherine held her first formal audiences. The nobility of Russia, those ancient boyar families whose bloodlines stretched back to the time of Ivan the Terrible, alongside the newer aristocrats created by Peter's reforms, gathered in their finest silks and furs to witness the spectacle of their new sovereign. Catherine moved among them with the grace of a dancer and the calculation of a chess master, her words carefully chosen to reassure the conservative, while hinting at the revolutionary changes that stirred in her mind like storm clouds on a distant horizon. The Empress understood that her German origins, rather than being a liability, could be transformed into an asset. She spoke of bringing European enlightenment to Russian soil, of civilizing the empire while preserving its essential character. Her voice, when she addressed the assembled courtiers, carried the musical cadences of her adopted language, each syllable precisely articulated yet warm with genuine emotion. She had studied the art of rhetoric under masters who understood that words could build empires as surely as armies, and now she deployed this knowledge with surgical precision. The military, that crucial pillar of any autocratic state, required particular attention. Catherine had learned from the mistakes of her late husband, whose attempts to Prussianize the Russian army had met with resistance from officers proud of their traditions and suspicious of foreign influence. She appeared before the Guards regiments in ceremonies that blended innovation with reverence for established customs, wearing uniforms that honored Russian military heritage while subtly incorporating elements that spoke of modernization and reform. In the private apartments of the Winter Palace, away from the ceremonial grandeur and the watchful eyes of courtiers, Catherine began the delicate work of constructing her inner circle. She had observed during her years as Grand Duchess how power flowed through unofficial channels as surely as through formal hierarchies, how a whispered conversation in a drawing room could carry more weight than a proclamation read from the steps of a cathedral. Her salon became a meeting place for minds that shared her vision of an enlightened autocracy, philosophers who had absorbed the teachings of Voltaire and Diderot, administrators who understood the practical challenges of governing a vast and diverse empire, military officers who combined professional competence with progressive thinking. Among these intimate advisors, Grigory Orlov occupied a place of particular significance. Their relationship, which had begun in the clandestine atmosphere of the conspiracy against Peter III, had evolved into something more complex than mere romantic attachment. Orlov possessed not only the physical courage that had made him invaluable during the coup, but also an intuitive understanding of Russian character that complemented Catherine's more theoretical knowledge. Through him, She gained access to currents of opinion that flowed far below the rarefied atmosphere of the court, reaching into the barracks and the merchant quarters, the monasteries and the provincial estates, where the true pulse of the empire could be felt. The correspondence that flowed from Catherine's private study during these early months revealed the breadth of her intellectual ambitions. Letters to Voltaire, carefully crafted to present herself as a worthy pupil of Enlightenment philosophy, carried news of her early reforms and her plans for legal codification. These missives were not merely diplomatic gestures, but genuine attempts to engage with the leading minds of her age, to position herself within the broader European conversation about governance, justice, and human progress. Each letter was a small masterpiece of persuasion, designed to convince its recipient that in the frozen vastness of Russia, a new Athens was being born. As winter settled over St. Petersburg in 1762, blanketing the city in pristine snow that muffled the sounds of daily life and transformed the capital into a crystalline wonderland, Catherine embarked upon her most ambitious intellectual undertaking. In the warmth of her private library, surrounded by volumes of Montesquieu, Beccaria, and the Encyclopédistes, she began work on what would become known as the Nakaz, her great instruction for the creation of a new legal code that would transform Russian society from its medieval foundations into something approaching enlightened modernity. The project consumed her days and often her nights, as she struggled to reconcile the abstract principles of Enlightenment philosophy with the harsh realities of Russian life. How could one apply the humanistic ideals of Cesare Beccaria's treatise on crime and punishment to a society where serfdom bound millions to lives of agricultural labor? How could Montesquieu's theories about the separation of powers function within an autocratic system that had evolved over centuries to concentrate all authority in the person of the sovereign? These questions haunted her correspondence and filled pages of draft legislation with corrections, revisions, and marginal notes that revealed the complexity of her thinking. The Nakaz, when it finally emerged from these laborious months of composition, represented perhaps the most remarkable document ever produced by an absolute monarch. In its 655 articles, Catherine attempted to create a synthesis of Enlightenment principles and practical governance that would serve as the foundation for a comprehensive reform of Russian law. She wrote of the natural equality of human beings, of the importance of proportionate punishment, of the need for laws that would protect the innocent while deterring the guilty. Her language carried the rhythmic beauty of classical rhetoric, each sentence carefully balanced to convey both legal precision and moral authority. Yet even as she labored over these theoretical constructions, Catherine remained acutely aware of the gulf that separated Enlightenment ideals from Russian realities. The institution of serfdom, which bound the vast majority of the Russian population to lives of agricultural servitude, posed a particular challenge to her reformist ambitions. She understood that the liberation of the serfs would represent the ultimate test of any claim to enlightened governance. Yet she also recognized that such a transformation could not be accomplished by imperial decree alone. The economic foundations of the empire, the social structures that had evolved over centuries, the expectations and fears of the noble class, all of these factors would need to be carefully managed if reform were to succeed rather than simply precipitate revolution. The convening of the Legislative Commission in 1767 represented Catherine's attempt to bridge this gap between theory and practice. Representatives from across the empire, nobles and merchants, Cossacks and clergy, even a handful of state peasants, gathered in Moscow to debate the principles outlined in the Nakaz and to propose specific reforms that might transform Russian society. The Empress herself attended many of these sessions, listening with careful attention as delegates from distant provinces described conditions that often contradicted her theoretical understanding of her realm. She heard testimonies about the harsh treatment of serfs, about corruption among local officials, about the need for better communications and more rational administrative structures. The debates that echoed through the halls of the Kremlin during the Commission's sessions revealed both the promise and the limitations of Catherine's reformist vision. Progressive delegates, inspired by the Empress's own rhetoric about equality and justice, proposed sweeping changes that would have fundamentally altered the character of Russian society. Conservative voices, representing the interests of the nobility and the established church, argued for incremental modifications that would preserve existing privileges while addressing the most egregious abuses. Catherine found herself in the position of a conductor, attempting to orchestrate a symphony from musicians who had never played together, each following a different score. As months passed and the Commission's deliberations continued, it became increasingly clear that the gap between Enlightenment theory and Russian practice could not be bridged by legislation alone. The noble delegates, while expressing theoretical support for the Empress's humanitarian principles, balked at specific proposals that would have limited their control over serf labor. The merchant representatives, eager for legal protections that would facilitate trade and commerce, found themselves at odds with both nobles and clergy over questions of taxation and privilege. Even the peasant delegates, when they spoke at all, often expressed views that reflected centuries of tradition rather than any embrace of progressive reform. Catherine watched these proceedings with the detached fascination of a natural philosopher, observing the behavior of specimens under laboratory conditions. She had begun the commission with high hopes that reasoned debate and enlightened discourse could produce consensus around her reformist agenda. What she discovered instead was that Russian society, like all complex organisms, possessed an internal logic that resisted external attempts at systematic transformation. The forces of tradition, self-interest, and simple human inertia proved far more powerful than the abstract appeal of philosophical principles. While Catherine wrestled with the intricacies of domestic reform, the horizons of her empire beckoned, with opportunities for territorial expansion that would test her skills as a military strategist and diplomatic negotiator. The Ottoman Empire, that ancient rival of Orthodox Russia, had long controlled access to the Black Sea, and the warm water ports that Catherine understood were essential for her nation's commercial and strategic future. The relationship between these two empires was one of perpetual tension, punctuated by periods of open warfare that had shaped the geopolitical landscape of Eastern Europe for centuries. The outbreak of the First Russo-Turkish War in 1768 provided Catherine with an opportunity to demonstrate that an empress could command armies as effectively as any emperor. The conflict began over competing claims to influence in Poland, but it quickly evolved into a broader struggle for dominance in the Black Sea region. Catherine approached the military challenge with the same systematic thoroughness that she had brought to legal reform, studying the writings of classical strategists and consulting with experienced generals about the logistical complexities of conducting campaigns across the vast steppes of southern Russia. The Russian forces that marched south under Catherine's banners represented the culmination of military reforms that had been evolving since the time of Peter the Great. The regiments combined traditional Russian resilience with European tactical innovations, creating formations that could adapt to the diverse challenges of steppe warfare. Catherine followed the progress of her armies through detailed reports that arrived by courier from distant battlefields, each dispatch bringing news of victories and setbacks that she absorbed with the calculation of a chess master contemplating her next move. The naval dimension of the conflict provided Catherine with an opportunity to project Russian power in ways that previous rulers had only dreamed of accomplishing. The dispatch of a Russian fleet from the Baltic to the Mediterranean, a journey that required passage through the straits controlled by hostile powers and navigation of waters far from Russian bases, represented a bold assertion of her empire's growing capabilities. When news arrived that Russian ships had defeated the Ottoman fleet at Chesme, Catherine received the victory dispatches in her private study overlooking the Neva, the flickering candlelight casting dancing shadows across, maps that showed Russian influence extending far beyond its traditional boundaries. The campaigns in the Crimean Peninsula and along the northern shores of the Black Sea brought Catherine face to face with the practical challenges of imperial expansion. The territories that her armies conquered were populated by diverse ethnic and religious groups, Tatars and Greeks, Christians and Muslims, nomadic peoples and settled farmers, each with their own traditions and loyalties. The Empress understood that military conquest was only the first step in true imperial expansion. The more difficult task was the integration of these new subjects into the broader framework of Russian civilization. The diplomatic negotiations that eventually ended the First Russo-Turkish War showcased Catherine's skill as an international negotiator. The Treaty of Küçükkaynarca, signed in 1774, represented far more than a simple peace settlement. It was a comprehensive redrawing of the balance of power in Eastern Europe. The treaty granted Russia navigation rights on the Black Sea, established Russian protectorate over Orthodox Christians within the Ottoman Empire, and created the legal foundation for future Russian expansion into the Crimean Peninsula and the Caucasus region. Catherine approached these diplomatic triumphs with a mixture of satisfaction and strategic caution. She understood that each territorial gain created new obligations and vulnerabilities, that expansion brought not only opportunities, but also the responsibility to defend and develop newly acquired territories. The Empress spent long hours in consultation with her advisors, poring over maps that showed the new boundaries of her empire, and discussing the administrative challenges that would accompany territorial integration. The colonization of New Russia, as the newly acquired territories came to be known, required Catherine to exercise all of her skills as an administrator and visionary leader. She recruited foreign colonists, Germans, Greeks, Bulgarians, and others, to settle the fertile steppes north of the Black Sea, offering them religious tolerance and exemption from military service in exchange for their agricultural expertise. The Empress envisioned these new territories as a laboratory for enlightened governance, where rational planning and progressive policies could create prosperous communities that would serve as models for the broader empire. The development of cities like Kherson, Nikolaev, and eventually Odessa represented Catherine's attempt to create urban centers that would embody her vision of European civilization, transplanted to Russian soil. She personally reviewed architectural plans and approved urban designs that incorporated the latest thinking about city planning and public health. These new cities, with their wide boulevards and neoclassical buildings, stood as monuments to her belief that human reason and imperial will could transform wilderness into centers of commerce and culture. Among the remarkable personalities who shaped Catherine's reign, none captured the Empress's imagination and trust more completely than Grigory Alexandrovich Potemkin. Their relationship, which began in the aftermath of the Turkish victories and evolved into one of the most complex partnerships in the history of monarchy, represented a fusion of personal attraction, intellectual compatibility, and shared imperial ambition that would define the next phase of Catherine's reign. Potemkin possessed a combination of military genius, administrative brilliance, and theatrical flair that perfectly complemented Catherine's own talents and temperament. The prince's first appearance at court had been unremarkable, another guards officer among many who competed for imperial attention. But Catherine, with her shrewd eye for exceptional talent, had recognized in Potemkin qualities that set him apart from the conventional courtiers who populated her drawing rooms. His letters to her, preserved in the imperial archives, reveal a mind that could move seamlessly from discussions of military strategy to philosophical speculation, from detailed administrative proposals to passionate declarations of personal devotion. These missives became the foundation of a correspondence that would span decades and illuminate the inner workings of one of history's most successful imperial partnerships. Potemkin's approach to the development of New Russia demonstrated the kind of grand vision that appealed to Catherine's own sense of imperial destiny. Where other administrators might have seen only empty steppes and logistical challenges, Potemkin envisioned a transformed landscape dotted with thriving cities, productive farms, and bustling ports that would make the Black Sea a Russian lake. His reports to the Empress painted pictures of the future in language that combined practical detail with poetic inspiration, describing harbors that would welcome ships from across the Mediterranean and agricultural settlements that would feed the growing population of the empire. The famous journey that Catherine undertook to inspect the southern territories in 1787 represented the culmination of Potemkin's efforts to translate vision into reality. The imperial procession, with its elaborate flotilla of barges decorated in the finest European style, its carefully orchestrated receptions in newly constructed towns, and its theatrical presentations of prosperity and progress has become legendary as an example of the power of carefully managed spectacle to shape political perception. Critics would later dismiss these displays as Potemkin villages, elaborate facades designed to conceal the reality of continued backwardness and poverty. Yet recent historical scholarship has revealed that the reality of Potemkin's achievements was far more substantial than his critics suggested. The cities he built were real, even if they were still growing when Catherine visited them. The economic development he promoted was genuine, even if it had not yet reached its full potential. The administrative structures he created would serve the empire well into the 19th century, providing the foundation for continued Russian expansion and development in the Black Sea region. Catherine, touring these territories with the eye of an experienced administrator, understood that she was witnessing not mere theatrical display, but the early stages of a genuine transformation. The personal dimension of Catherine's relationship with Potemkin added layers of complexity to their official partnership. Their romantic attachment, which scandalized some courtiers and intrigued foreign diplomats, represented something far more sophisticated than a simple royal affair. Both Catherine and Potemkin were individuals of exceptional intelligence and ambition who found in each other partners capable of understanding and supporting their grandest aspirations. Their private correspondence reveals two minds working in harmony toward common goals, each contributing unique strengths to their shared enterprise. Catherine's letters to Potemkin during his southern campaigns show her not only as empress, but as a woman capable of deep emotional attachment. She worried about his health during the rigors of military life, celebrated his victories with genuine joy, and offered counsel that drew upon her own hard-won experience of leadership and decision-making. These letters, written in the privacy of her study during the quiet hours before dawn, reveal a side of Catherine's personality that the formal protocols of court life rarely allowed to emerge, a capacity for vulnerability and tenderness that complemented her public persona of imperial authority. The administrative innovations that emerged from the Catherine-Potemkin partnership would influence Russian governance for generations. Their collaboration produced new approaches to provincial administration, military organization, and economic development that reflected both Enlightenment principles and practical Russian needs. Potemkin's genius lay in his ability to translate Catherine's theoretical understanding of good governance into concrete policies that could function effectively in the challenging environment of the empire's borderlands. Together, they created a model of imperial expansion that emphasized not merely conquest, but genuine integration and development. As the 1780s progressed and Catherine's reign reached its mature phase, the partnership with Potemkin evolved from romantic attachment to something approaching intellectual marriage. They continued to work together on the great projects of territorial development and administrative reform, but their relationship had acquired the comfortable rhythm of two experienced leaders who understood each other's methods and trusted each other's judgment. Their collaboration became a template for the kind of enlightened autocracy that Catherine had envisioned from the beginning of her reign, a system that combined absolute authority with rational planning, imperial ambition with humanitarian concern, traditional Russian strength with European sophistication. The success of Catherine's southern policies, achieved through her partnership with Potemkin, established a pattern that would characterize the remainder of her reign. She had learned to identify exceptional individuals who shared her vision, and to delegate significant authority to them while maintaining overall strategic control. This approach allowed her to extend her influence across the vast expanse of her empire while concentrating her personal attention on the most important questions of policy and principle. The Empress had discovered that enlightened autocracy could function effectively only through the cultivation of enlightened collaborators, and in Potemkin, she had found the most capable and devoted of all such partners. As Catherine reviewed the reports that arrived from the southern territories, accounts of new cities rising from empty steppes, harbours welcoming increasing numbers of merchant vessels, and agricultural settlements producing crops that would feed the empire's growing population, she understood that she had successfully translated her youthful dreams of enlightened governance into concrete achievements. The partnership with Potemkin had proved that even in the context of absolute monarchy, collaborative leadership could produce results that exceeded what any individual, however talented, could accomplish alone. The Black Sea had indeed become a Russian lake, and the steppes of New Russia were becoming the granary of the empire, just as they had envisioned during those long planning sessions in the Winter Palace, where candlelight had illuminated maps of territories yet to be conquered and cities yet to be built. The morning light that filtered through the tall windows of the Winter Palace in 1774 carried with it more than the promise of another St. Petersburg day. It illuminated the face of a woman who had transformed from German princess to Russian sovereign, and who now stood on the threshold of her greatest achievements. Catherine, at 45, possessed the confidence that comes only from having weathered the storms of early rule and emerged victorious. The Pugachev Rebellion lay crushed behind her, its echoes fading into the vast steppes from which it had emerged, and before her stretched the golden path of expansion that would make her name immortal. In the quiet hours before the court awakened, Catherine would often walk the corridors of her palace, her silk slippers whispering against marble floors that reflected the light of countless candles. These were moments of contemplation, when the weight of empire settled upon her shoulders like a familiar cloak. She had learned to carry this burden not as a weight, but as wings that might lift Russia to heights undreamed of by her predecessors. The very air seemed to shimmer with possibility, as if the palace itself understood that it housed not merely a ruler, but an architect of destiny. The Black Sea called to her with voices that spoke of ancient Greek colonies and Byzantine dreams. For centuries, Russia had gazed southward toward these waters, like a landlocked bird yearning for the ocean. The Ottoman Empire, that great rival that had for so long barred Russian ships from these ancient routes, had shown cracks in its mighty facade. Catherine's generals whispered of opportunity. Her admirals dreamed of fleets cutting through waters that had known only Turkish sails, and her diplomats wove webs of alliance that stretched across European courts like silk threads catching morning dew. In the autumn of 1774, as golden leaves fell like scattered coins around the fountains of Tsarskoye Selo, Catherine received word that would change the very map of her empire. The Treaty of Kuchuk-Kainaka, signed in a tent on the distant Bulgarian steppes, granted Russia something that had seemed impossible just decades before: access to the Black Sea and the right to protect Orthodox Christians within the Ottoman Empire. The document, bearing seals and signatures that seemed to glow in the candlelight, was more than paper and ink. It was the key that would unlock the southern door of Russian ambition. Catherine held this treaty in her hands, as if it were made of spun gold, understanding that she now possessed what Ivan the Terrible had dreamed of, what Peter the Great had longed for, what generations of Russian rulers had sought through blood and diplomacy. The Black Sea, that ancient highway of civilizations, would soon know the double-headed eagle of Russia reflected in its depths. She could almost hear the future echoing through the halls of the Winter Palace. The sounds of Russian merchants haggling in Constantinople's markets, Russian ships loading grain from Crimean ports, Russian bells ringing across the waters where once only the call to prayer had sounded. But Catherine understood that conquest was only the beginning of greatness. As winter settled over St. Petersburg like a familiar friend, she turned her attention to the deeper transformation that would truly mark her reign. The Enlightenment, that great movement of reason and progress that swept across Europe like a cleansing wind, had found in Catherine not merely an admirer, but a devoted apostle. Her correspondence with Voltaire had grown from formal diplomatic exchange to something approaching genuine friendship, their letters crossing the frozen expanses between St. Petersburg and Fernie, like migrating birds carrying messages of mutual admiration. In her private study, surrounded by volumes that bore the thoughts of Diderot, Voltaire, and Montesquieu, Catherine began to dream of a Russia transformed not merely by conquest, but by enlightenment. She envisioned cities where learning flourished like flowers in a well-tended garden, universities where Russian minds would grapple with the great questions of existence, libraries where the wisdom of ages would be preserved between leather covers that smelled of knowledge and eternity. The candles that burned late into the winter nights illuminated not just her reading, but the blueprints of a cultural renaissance that would make Russia the equal of any European power. The great experiment began with the establishment of the Free Economic Society in 1765, but it was in the 1770s that Catherine's vision truly began to take tangible form. She decreed the founding of schools where children of all classes might learn to read and write, where the Russian language would flourish alongside Latin and Greek, where mathematics and natural philosophy would open minds to the wonders of creation. These schools rose across her empire like lighthouses on a dark coast, each one a beacon of learning that would guide future generations toward enlightenment. The spring of 1783 brought with it more than the usual thaw of Russian rivers, and the return of migrating birds to the northern forests. It brought the fulfillment of Catherine's most audacious dream, the annexation of Crimea. This peninsula, jutting into the Black Sea like a precious jewel suspended in azure waters, had been the crown of the Crimean Khanate for 3 centuries. Its Tatar rulers had sworn fealty to the Ottoman Sultan. Its ports had known only Islamic law. Its steps had echoed with the prayers of a different faith. Yet Catherine, with the patience of a chess master and the vision of a conqueror, had maneuvered this prize into Russian hands without firing a shot. The morning when Prince Grigory Potemkin, her most trusted general, and perhaps the love of her life, sent word that the Russian flag flew over Bakhchisarai, Catherine stood in her palace gardens watching the ice break up on the Neva River. The metaphor was not lost on her. Just as winter's grip loosened to allow the waters to flow freely, so too had Russia broken the bonds that had long constrained its southern ambitions. The Crimean Peninsula, with its ancient Greek ruins and Tatar palaces, its fertile valleys and strategic harbors, was now part of the Russian Empire. The Khan, who had once ruled from his palace in Bakhchisarai, was now in exile, and Russian administrators were already planning the transformation of this Muslim realm into an Orthodox province. Catherine's joy at this acquisition was tempered by her understanding of its profound implications. Crimea was not merely territory to be governed. It was a symbol, a statement to Europe and the Ottoman Empire that Russia had arrived as a true great power. When she planned her famous journey to the south in 1787, it was with the full knowledge that she was not simply visiting a new province, but making a pilgrimage to the altar of Russian destiny. Every detail of this journey was choreographed to demonstrate not just Russia's new territorial reach, but its cultural sophistication and military might. The preparation for Catherine's southern journey consumed months of planning that would have impressed the most elaborate theatrical production. Potemkin, who had become the architect of Russian expansion in the south, understood that this voyage was more than a royal progress. It was a carefully orchestrated demonstration of power, designed to awe foreign observers and convince them that Russia had truly transformed from a northern backwater into a European great power. Villages were beautified, roads were improved, and at every stop along the route, displays were prepared that would showcase Russian culture, prosperity, and military strength. When Catherine's convoy finally set out from St. Petersburg in the early months of 1787, it resembled nothing so much as a moving city. Her travelling court included foreign ambassadors, European intellectuals, Russian nobles, servants, guards, and enough luggage to stock a palace. The Empress herself travelled in a carriage that was itself a work of art, its wheels cushioned to provide the smoothest possible ride, its interior appointed with every luxury that 18th century craftsmanship could provide. Behind her stretched a procession of carriages, wagons, and mounted guards that seemed to go on forever, like a river of silk and steel flowing across the Russian landscape. As this magnificent procession moved southward through the heart of European Russia, Catherine gazed out at landscapes that told the story of her empire's transformation. Where once there had been only wilderness and scattered settlements, she now saw thriving towns with Orthodox churches whose golden domes caught the sunlight like captured stars. Where once there had been only the rough dwellings of frontier life, she now saw manor houses that would not have been out of place in the suburbs of Paris or Vienna. The very soil seemed to bloom under Russian cultivation, as if the earth itself recognized the beneficent rule that had replaced the chaos of earlier times. But it was when Catherine's journey reached the newly annexed territories of the south that the true magnitude of Russian transformation became apparent. The cities that Potemkin had founded or expanded along the route seemed to rise from the steppe like miracles of Russian engineering and vision. Ekaterinoslav, named in the Empress's honor, spread along the banks of the Dnieper River like a jewel set in silver. Its broad avenues and classical buildings proclaimed that European civilization had reached even these distant shores, that Russian culture could flourish in any soil where Russian rule took root. When Catherine finally reached the shores of the Black Sea and gazed out over waters that now belonged to her empire, the moment was pregnant with historical significance that seemed almost too profound for words. Here, where ancient Greek colonists had once established their cities, where Byzantine merchants had traded their silks and spices, where Ottoman galleys had patrolled in the name of the Sultan, Russian ships now cut through waves that reflected the double-headed eagle of the Romanov dynasty. The wind that filled their sails carried with it the promise of trade routes that would enrich Russian merchants, of naval bases that would project Russian power throughout the eastern Mediterranean, of a future in which the Black Sea would be as much a Russian lake as the Baltic had become under Peter the Great. While Catherine's southern conquests captured the imagination of Europe and struck fear into the hearts of her enemies, it was perhaps in the realm of architecture and urban planning that her vision achieved its most lasting expression. The St. Petersburg that emerged during the golden years of her reign was no longer merely Peter the Great's window on Europe, but had become a showcase of imperial magnificence that rivaled Paris, Vienna, or London in its grandeur. Every street, every palace, every public building had been conceived as part of a greater whole, an urban symphony composed in stone and bronze that would proclaim Russian cultural achievement for centuries to come. The Winter Palace itself had grown during Catherine's reign from an impressive royal residence into something approaching a city within a city. Its endless corridors now housed not only the living quarters of the imperial family and their vast retinue of servants, but also the beginnings of what would become one of the world's great art collections. Catherine's passion for acquiring the masterpieces of European art had transformed room after room of the palace into galleries where Rembrandt's brushstrokes caught the light of crystal chandeliers, where classical sculptures gazed eternally, across parquet floors that reflected their marble perfection, where the treasures of dissolved European collections found new homes in the northern capital of the Russian Empire. The story of how Catherine assembled this magnificent collection reads like a chapter from a fairy tale about a princess who could command treasures from across the world with a wave of her hand. When the collection of the French art dealer Pierre-Étienne Falconet became available, Catherine's agents swept in to acquire paintings that had once graced the walls of Parisian salons. When European wars and revolutions forced noble families to sell their ancestral treasures, Russian gold appeared as if by magic to transport these masterpieces to the banks of the Neva River. Each acquisition was more than a simple purchase. It was a statement that Russia had joined the ranks of those nations sophisticated enough to appreciate and preserve the highest achievements of human creativity. But Catherine's cultural ambitions extended far beyond the accumulation of existing masterpieces. She understood that true greatness lay not merely in acquiring the achievements of others, but in fostering the conditions under which new genius might flourish. The Academy of Arts that she expanded and enriched became a beacon that drew talented young Russians from across the empire, offering them training that rivaled anything available in Rome or Paris. In the studios of this academy, young Russian artists learned to capture light and shadow with the skill of old masters, while Russian sculptors discovered how to breathe life into marble and bronze. The results of this cultural investment became visible throughout St. Petersburg, as the city adorned itself with works of art that proclaimed the sophistication of Russian taste and the skill of Russian hands. Public squares bloomed with monuments that told the story of Russian greatness, their bronze figures catching the light of northern summers and standing patient guard through the long winters. Palace gardens were transformed into outdoor galleries where classical statuary created vistas of timeless beauty, where visitors from across Europe might walk and marvel at the taste and refinement of their Russian hosts. Among Catherine's most ambitious architectural projects was the construction of the Hermitage, a private retreat adjacent to the Winter Palace, where she might escape the ceremonial demands of court life and pursue her passion for art and learning in more intimate surroundings. This building, whose very name suggested withdrawal from the world, became paradoxically one of the most celebrated spaces in the empire, a place where European visitors were received with a sophistication that surprised those who still thought of Russia as a barbarous frontier. The rooms of the Hermitage were designed not merely as display spaces for Catherine's growing art collection, but as chambers where civilization itself might be cultivated and refined. In these carefully appointed rooms, Catherine held intimate gatherings that brought together the finest minds of her era. Russian nobles mingled with visiting European intellectuals, diplomats shared dinner tables with artists, and conversations ranged across the full spectrum of human knowledge with an ease that would have been impossible in the more formal settings of official court functions. These evenings in the Hermitage represented Catherine's vision of what Russian society might become: cultivated, cosmopolitan, and confident in its ability to contribute to the great conversations that shaped European thought. The transformation of St. Petersburg during these golden years extended far beyond the imperial palaces to encompass the entire urban landscape. Catherine's city planners worked with the methodical precision of master gardeners, laying out broad avenues that would allow the northern light to penetrate into every quarter of the city, designing public spaces that would serve both practical and aesthetic functions, creating vistas that would lift the spirits of residents and visitors alike. The granite embankments of the Neva River were extended and perfected until they formed a continuous promenade from which the full grandeur of the city might be appreciated, while bridges of classical design connected the various districts of the capital in harmony with the natural flow of the river. As the 1780s unfolded like a tapestry woven from threads of gold and silk, Catherine found herself occupying a unique position in the landscape of European politics and culture. She had become what philosophers of the Enlightenment had only dared to dream of: an absolute monarch who wielded unlimited power in service of reason, progress, and human betterment. Her correspondence with the great thinkers of her age had evolved from the careful politeness of diplomatic exchange into genuine intellectual partnership, and her court had become a destination for anyone seeking to witness the practical application of Enlightenment principles to the art of government. The irony of Catherine's position was not lost on her more perceptive observers. Here was a German-born woman who had seized power through a palace coup, who ruled over an empire built on serfdom and maintained by military force, yet who had somehow managed to convince both herself and much of Europe that she embodied the highest ideals of rational governance. This contradiction lay at the heart of her reign, like a beautiful but flawed jewel, casting brilliant light while harboring shadows that would eventually darken her legacy. Yet in the golden years of the 1770s and 1780s, these shadows seemed small and distant, easily obscured by the dazzling achievements of territorial expansion, cultural flourishing, and administrative reform. Catherine's most ambitious attempt to reconcile Enlightenment principles with autocratic rule was her Nakaz, or instruction, a comprehensive legal code that she began drafting in the 1760s and continued to refine throughout her reign. This document, which drew heavily on the works of Montesquieu and Beccaria, represented nothing less than an attempt to create a new foundation for Russian law based on reason rather than tradition, on the rights of citizens rather than the whims of rulers. Night after night, Catherine labored over this text by candlelight, weighing each phrase for its philosophical implications, consulting her beloved books for precedents and principles that might be adapted to Russian conditions. The Nakaz proclaimed principles that seemed almost revolutionary in the context of 18th century autocracy: that laws should be clear and consistent, that punishment should fit the crime, that torture should be abolished, that even the lowest subjects possess certain inalienable rights. When Catherine convened the Legislative Commission in 1767 to consider these proposals, Representatives from across the empire gathered in Moscow like delegates to a parliament, each carrying with them the hopes and grievances of their constituents. For a brief, shining moment, it seemed as though Russia might peacefully evolve from autocracy towards something approaching constitutional government. Yet the realities of governing an empire that stretched from the Baltic to the Pacific, that encompassed dozens of different peoples with their own languages, religions, and customs, proved more complex than even Catherine's systematic mind could fully comprehend. The Legislative Commission became bogged down in debates that revealed the enormous gulfs that separated Russian nobles from urban merchants, Orthodox believers from Muslim subjects, central administrators from provincial governors. The elegant principles of the Nakaz, which had seemed so clear and logical in Catherine's study, became tangled in the messy realities of Russian social and economic life. Still, Catherine's commitment to Enlightenment ideals found expression in countless smaller reforms that gradually transformed the daily experience of her subjects. She established hospitals where the sick might receive care, regardless of their social station, founded schools where children could learn to read and write in an age when literacy was still a rare privilege, created institutions for the care of orphans and the elderly that reflected her belief that even the most vulnerable members of society deserved compassion and support. Each of these reforms was modest in scope, yet collectively they represented a fundamental shift in the relationship between ruler and ruled, from the arbitrary exercise of power towards something approaching systematic governance based on rational principles. The provincial reform of 1775 perhaps best exemplified Catherine's approach to practical enlightenment. Rather than attempting to revolutionize Russian administration overnight, she methodically reorganized local government to create more efficient and responsive institutions. New administrative districts were created with populations large enough to support professional governance, but small enough to remain responsive to local needs. Courts were established that would operate according to written law rather than local custom or official whim. Police forces were organized that would maintain order while protecting the rights of law-abiding citizens. These reforms were implemented gradually, province by province, with careful attention to local conditions and traditions. Catherine understood that lasting change must grow organically from Russian soil rather than being imposed from above, like an exotic plant that might wither in an unfamiliar climate. She traveled extensively throughout her empire during these years, observing firsthand how her reforms were taking root, listening to the concerns of local officials and ordinary citizens alike, adjusting her policies to reflect the lessons learned from practical experience. The culmination of Catherine's administrative genius was perhaps the Charter of the Nobility of 1785, a document that finally provided legal definition to the rights and responsibilities of Russia's ruling class. This charter guaranteed nobles freedom from corporal punishment, exemption from personal taxation, and the right to own populated estates, privileges that had existed in practice but had never before been codified in law. Yet the charter also imposed obligations. Nobles were expected to serve the state in military or civilian capacities, to educate their children in service to the empire, to maintain the dignity of their rank through appropriate conduct. By codifying these relationships in law, Catherine created a framework for governance that would outlast her own reign. The charter transformed the Russian nobility from a service class that existed at the pleasure of the autocrat into something approaching a constitutional estate with legally protected rights and clearly defined responsibilities. This transformation represented a fundamental shift in the nature of Russian government, moving it away from the personal rule of earlier centuries toward the institutional governance that characterized more advanced European states. As Catherine's empire reached the peak of its golden age in the late 1780s, her ambitions began to extend beyond the borders of the Black Sea toward even more distant and glorious prizes. The Ottoman Empire, that ancient rival that had for so long blocked Russian access to the warm waters of the south, showed increasing signs of weakness and internal discord. Catherine's spies reported that the Sultan's government struggled with financial crisis, military defeat, and provincial rebellion, while her diplomats detected growing European concern about Ottoman stability. In the elegant salons of her Hermitage, Surrounded by the artistic treasures that proclaimed her empire's cultural sophistication, Catherine began to dream of an even more audacious prize: the restoration of Orthodox Christian rule to Constantinople itself. This vision, which Catherine called her Greek project, represented the ultimate synthesis of her territorial ambitions, religious convictions, and historical imagination. She envisioned the creation of a new Byzantine empire that would restore Christian rule to the city of Constantine, bringing liberation to the Orthodox populations of the Balkans, while extending Russian influence into the very heart of the Eastern Mediterranean. The new empire would be ruled by her infant grandson, appropriately named Constantine, in honor of the first Christian emperor, while Russia would serve as the protector and patron of this reborn Christian state. To modern observers, Catherine's Greek project might seem like nothing more than the fantasy of an over-ambitious monarch drunk on her own success. Yet, in the context of the late 18th century, when the Ottoman Empire appeared to be collapsing under the weight of its own contradictions, the project seemed both feasible and attractive to many European observers. The Empress had already demonstrated her ability to wrest significant territories from Ottoman control. Her armies had proven their superiority in battle, and her navy was beginning to challenge Ottoman dominance in the Black Sea. Catherine's partner in this grandiose scheme was Joseph II of Austria, that earnest reformer who shared many of her Enlightenment sympathies and who possessed his own reasons for desiring Ottoman weakness. Together, they developed detailed plans for the partition of Ottoman territories in Europe, with Austria gaining control of Serbia and western portions of the Balkans, while Russia would dominate the eastern regions and establish its protégé in Constantinople. Secret negotiations between Vienna and St. Petersburg produced maps that carved up the Ottoman Empire with the same methodical precision that had earlier been applied to Poland, treating ancient territories as if they were properties to be divided among heirs. The Second Russo-Turkish War, which began in 1787, was intended to transform these diplomatic fantasies into concrete reality. Catherine's preparations for this conflict represented the full mobilization of her empire's resources, with armies assembled that dwarfed any force Russia had previously sent into battle. Her generals were the finest that Russian military education could produce. Her equipment represented the latest in military technology, and her war aims were nothing less than the fundamental reshaping of the balance of power in southeastern Europe. Yet the war that was supposed to crown Catherine's reign with glory instead revealed the limits of even her formidable empire. The Ottoman forces, fighting for their very survival, proved more resilient than Russian intelligence had predicted. The Austrian alliance, which had seemed so solid in the drawing rooms of diplomacy, proved fragile under the pressures of actual warfare. European powers that had initially viewed Russian expansion with relative equanimity began to recognize that Catherine's success threatened to upset the entire continental balance of power. The siege of Ochakov in 1788 became emblematic of the frustrations that plagued Catherine's grand design. This Ottoman fortress, guarding the mouth of the Dnieper River, should have fallen quickly to Russian arms if the predictions of easy victory had been accurate. Instead, it held out for months against repeated Russian assaults, consuming resources and lives that Catherine could ill afford to lose. When the fortress finally fell, its capture came at such cost that victory felt more like defeat, and Catherine began to understand that her Mediterranean dreams might prove more elusive than her earlier conquests. The death of Joseph II in 1790 effectively ended the Austrian alliance and forced Catherine to confront the reality that her Greek project had been premised on European conditions that no longer existed. The French Revolution, which had begun in 1789 as a distant rumble of discontent, was transforming into an earthquake that threatened to topple monarchies across Europe. Catherine, who had once corresponded warmly with French philosophes about the rights of man and the progress of reason, now watched in horror as these same ideas were used to justify regicide and social revolution. The transformation of Catherine's attitudes toward the Enlightenment represented one of the most profound ironies of her later reign. The same woman who had once proudly proclaimed herself a disciple of Voltaire and Diderot, now banned their works from her empire, fearing that ideas which had seemed harmless when confined to polite philosophical discussion might prove dangerously inflammatory when applied to practical politics. The French Revolution forced Catherine to confront the contradiction that had always existed at the heart of her reign: the impossible task of promoting reason and progress while maintaining absolute power over a society built on fundamental inequality. By 1792, when Catherine finally made peace with the Ottoman Empire through the Treaty of Jassy, her territorial gains were substantial but fell far short of her original ambitions. Russia acquired significant territories along the Black Sea coast and confirmed its dominance over the Crimean Peninsula, but Constantinople remained under Ottoman rule, and the Greek project had dissolved into the stuff of diplomatic memory. Catherine had learned the hard lesson that even the mightiest empire could not bend history entirely to its will, that the dreams conceived in palace chambers must ultimately face the test of reality on distant battlefields. Yet even as her grand Mediterranean vision faded, Catherine could take satisfaction in the solid achievements that her reign had produced. The Black Sea had indeed become a Russian lake. Russian merchants now traded freely in ports that had been closed to them for centuries, and the Ottoman Empire had been forced to acknowledge Russia as an equal in the game of great power politics. The territories that Russia had gained were not the stuff of fantasy, but real provinces that could be governed, developed, and integrated into the broader structure of the empire. Catherine's reign had transformed Russia from a regional power into a truly European great power, even if it had not achieved the complete mastery of southeastern Europe that her ambitions had originally envisioned. The years that followed would test every fiber of Catherine's being, every lesson learned in the corridors of power, every alliance forged in the shadows of the Winter Palace. For as the Empress moved deeper into the complexities of absolute rule, she would discover that the crown which had once felt so natural upon her brow now carried the accumulated weight of an empire's contradictions, its endless needs, and its restless souls yearning for justice that seemed forever beyond reach. In the quiet hours before dawn, when the palace lay wrapped in the deep silence of a Russian winter, Catherine would often find herself walking the same corridors where she had once plotted her rise to power. But now, instead of ambition driving her steps, it was the burden of countless decisions that would echo through generations. The woman who had once been Sophie Auguste Friederike had learned to carry the mantle of absolute authority. Yet, with each passing year, she felt more acutely the isolation that such power inevitably brought. The empire she ruled stretched from the Baltic shores to the Pacific coast, from the Arctic tundra to the warm waters of the Black Sea. Yet for all its vastness, for all the millions who called her sovereign, Catherine found herself increasingly aware of the delicate balance required to hold such a realm together. The nobles who bowed in her presence harbored their own ambitions. The merchants sought privileges that might conflict with the greater good. And beneath it all, the vast majority of her subjects, the serfs, remained bound to the land and there, masters in ways that troubled her enlightened sensibilities. It was during these contemplative years that Catherine began to grapple more seriously with the fundamental contradiction that lay at the heart of her reign. She had read Voltaire and Diderot, had corresponded with the great minds of the Enlightenment, had even attempted to codify laws based on reason and humanitarian principles. Yet the reality of governing Russia meant making compromises that her younger, more idealistic self might have found abhorrent. Chapter 7. The Philosopher's Burden. The morning light filtered through the tall windows of Catherine's private study, illuminating the thousands of volumes that lined the walls from floor to ceiling. Here, surrounded by the works of history's greatest thinkers, the Empress would spend hours each day reading, writing, and wrestling with the eternal questions of governance. How does one rule justly? How does one balance the needs of the many against the privileges of the few? How does one implement reform without destroying the very foundations upon which the state rests? These were not merely academic questions for Catherine. Every policy decision, every law she signed, Every appointment she made carried real consequences for millions of people. The weight of this responsibility had grown heavier with each passing year, particularly as she watched other monarchs across Europe struggle with their own challenges. The American colonies had successfully rebelled against British rule, creating a new nation based on the very Enlightenment principles she admired. In France, the seeds of revolution were already being sown, though few could yet imagine the storm that would soon engulf that ancient kingdom. Catherine's own attempts at reform had met with mixed results. Her Nakaz, the great legal code she had labored over for years, remained largely unimplemented due to resistance from the nobility and the practical difficulties of governing such a vast and diverse empire. The charter to the nobility, which had secured the loyalty of Russia's elite by guaranteeing their privileges, had strengthened her position, but also entrenched the very system of serfdom that her humanitarian instincts told her was wrong. Yet, even as she struggled with these contradictions, Catherine continued to pursue intellectual and cultural advancement with the same passion that had driven her political ascent. The Hermitage collection continued to grow as she acquired masterpieces from across Europe, creating what would become one of the world's greatest repositories of art and culture. She established the Free Economic Society, encouraging agricultural improvement and economic development. Schools were founded, libraries expanded, and Russian literature began to flourish under her patronage. In her correspondence with European intellectuals, Catherine presented herself as an enlightened monarch, working to modernize and humanize her realm. To Voltaire, she wrote eloquently about the progress of reason and justice in Russia. To Diderot, she spoke of education and the advancement of human knowledge. Yet even as she penned these letters, she was acutely aware of the gap between her aspirations and the realities of governing an empire built on centuries of tradition and hierarchy. The Empress had learned that change, particularly in a realm as vast and complex as Russia, could not be imposed by decree alone. It required patience, diplomacy, and often compromise. She had seen what happened to rulers who moved too quickly, who tried to overturn established orders without carefully preparing the ground. The fate of her own husband, Peter III, served as a constant reminder of the dangers of alienating powerful interests. As Catherine entered the third decade of her reign, she faced challenges that would test not only her political acumen, but her very understanding of power and its proper use. The most serious of these came from an unexpected quarter: the vast steppes of the southeast, where a man named Yemelyan Pugachev had begun to gather followers with claims that shook the very foundations of her authority. Pugachev was a Don Cossack, a man of the frontier who understood the grievances of common soldiers and peasants in ways that no courtier ever could. In the autumn of 1773, he made a declaration that would echo across the empire like thunder before a storm. He claimed to be Peter III, Catherine's supposedly murdered husband, miraculously survived and returned to reclaim his rightful throne. It was a lie. But it was a lie that spoke to deeper truths about the resentments and hopes of Russia's oppressed masses. The news reached Catherine while she was reviewing architectural plans for new additions to the Winter Palace, her mind occupied with questions of proportion and beauty. When her secretary entered with the dispatch from the southeastern provinces, she initially dismissed it as another minor disturbance, the sort of local uprising that occurred periodically in the frontier regions. But as more reports arrived, each more alarming than the last, she began to understand that this was something far more serious. Pugachev had not simply declared himself emperor, he had promised to abolish serfdom, to redistribute land to the peasants, to eliminate the hated poll tax that burdened the common people, and to grant freedom to all those who joined his cause. These promises, impossible as they might be to implement, spoke to the deepest longings of millions of Russians who had never known anything but oppression and poverty. As autumn turned to winter, the rebellion spread like wildfire across the Volga region. Entire garrisons declared for the pretender. Serfs rose against their masters, and local officials fled or were killed. The carefully constructed hierarchy that maintained Russian society began to crumble in those regions where Pugachev's forces held sway. Catherine, watching from her palace as reports of the rebellion's growth arrived daily, felt a chill that had nothing to do with the Russian winter. This was not merely a military challenge, it was a fundamental questioning of her legitimacy and the entire system she represented. Pugachev's claim to be Peter III was more than just an attempt at deception. It was a rejection of her right to rule, a declaration that her reign had been built on usurpation and murder. Worse still, his promises to the common people highlighted the very contradictions she had been wrestling with in her private moments of reflection. The Empress found herself in the strange position of preparing to defend a system she herself had criticized, of using force to suppress people whose grievances she privately acknowledged as just. The philosophical discussions in her study, the elegant correspondence with Voltaire and Diderot, the careful plans for gradual reform, all of these seemed suddenly inadequate in the face of popular uprising and the harsh demands of maintaining order. Catherine's response revealed both her political pragmatism and her understanding of power's realities. She appointed Alexander Suvorov, one of her most capable generals, to command the forces sent against Pugachev. She offered rewards for the pretender's capture and punishments for those who supported him, but she also began to consider more carefully the underlying causes of the rebellion, the grievances that had made Pugachev's promises so appealing to so many. Through the long winter months of 1774, the rebellion raged across southeastern Russia, while Catherine managed the crisis from her palace in St. Petersburg. Each morning brought new dispatches, new reports of towns taken or retaken, of battles won and lost, of atrocities committed by both sides in the bitter struggle for control of the empire's future. The Empress maintained her daily routines, receiving ministers and ambassadors, reviewing state papers and presiding over court ceremonies as if nothing had changed. But those closest to her could see the strain in her eyes, the way her hands would pause over documents, the long moments of silence when she stared out the windows toward the south, where her empire was tearing itself apart. The rebellion forced Catherine to confront truths she had long preferred to avoid. The peasants who flocked to Pugachev's banner were not motivated by ignorance or foreign influence, as some of her advisors suggested, but by real suffering and legitimate grievances. The serfs who worked the great estates lived lives of grinding, poverty and powerlessness, subject to the whims of masters who could buy, sell, or punish them almost without limit. The soldiers who joined the rebellion were often men pressed into service against their will, poorly fed and badly treated by officers who saw them as little more than tools of war. Yet even as she acknowledged these injustices, Catherine understood that her response to the rebellion would define her reign and determine Russia's future. To give in to Pugachev's demands would mean abandoning the very foundations of Russian society, potentially throwing the empire into chaos from which it might never recover. To crush the rebellion completely would require methods that contradicted her enlightened principles and might create grievances that would fuel future uprisings. As spring arrived and the military situation began to turn in the government's favor, Catherine wrestled with questions that had no easy answers. Suvorov's forces were gradually gaining the upper hand, pushing Pugachev's army back across the steppes and retaking the towns and fortresses that had declared for the pretender. But each victory came at a cost, not just in lives lost, but in the harsh methods required to restore order and discourage future rebellions. The Empress found herself authorizing punishments that would have appalled the young woman who had once dreamed of ruling through reason and benevolence. Villages that had supported Pugachev were burned, their inhabitants scattered or executed. Captured rebels faced interrogation, torture, and death, their fate serving as a warning to others who might consider challenging imperial authority. The iron fist of state power, usually hidden beneath the velvet glove of civilization, was revealed in all its brutal necessity. When Pugachev was finally captured by his own followers, who hoped to earn pardons by betraying their leader, Catherine faced her final decision in the affair. The pretender was brought to Moscow in an iron cage, displayed to the people as a warning and a symbol of the fate that awaited those who challenged the established order. His execution, when it came, was both a legal proceeding and a ritual of state, designed to demonstrate that the natural order had been restored and justice satisfied. Yet as Catherine watched from her palace, while news of Pugachev's death spread across the empire, she felt no satisfaction, only a deep weariness and a profound understanding of the loneliness that came with absolute power. She had preserved the throne and maintained the empire's stability, but at a cost that would haunt her for the rest of her reign. The enlightened empress had been forced to act as any autocrat might, using violence and terror to maintain order and protect the system that had made her great. The years following the Pugachev Rebellion brought a different sort of challenge to Catherine's reign, one perhaps more difficult than open rebellion. The slow erosion of idealism that comes with long experience of power and its corruptions. The empress, who had once believed she could transform Russia through the application of reason and enlightened principles, now understood more clearly the constraints within which any ruler must operate. The empire continued to expand under her guidance as Russian forces pushed south toward the Black Sea and west into territories that had long been dominated by the Ottoman Empire and Poland. Each victory brought new territories to govern, new peoples to integrate into the Russian system, new challenges to the administrative structures she had worked so hard to reform and improve. The very success of her reign created complexities that no amount of philosophical reflection could easily resolve. In the Winter Palace, Catherine established routines that would sustain her through the remaining years of her reign. She rose each morning before dawn, spending the early hours in prayer and meditation before beginning the day's work. Her correspondence, once filled with the enthusiasm of youth and the excitement of new ideas, took on a more measured tone, reflecting the hard-won wisdom of experience and the sobering realities of governance. The Empress continued to read voraciously, adding new volumes to her already impressive library and maintaining correspondence with intellectuals across Europe. But her letters now often carried notes of caution, warnings about the dangers of moving too quickly toward reform, observations about the difficulties of implementing theoretical principles in the practical world of politics and administration. The student of Enlightenment, thought had become its critic, not from opposition to its ideals, but from intimate knowledge of the obstacles to their realization. Catherine's relationship with the nobility evolved as well during these later years. The charter to the nobility had secured their loyalty and established their privileges, but it had also created expectations and entitlements that sometimes conflicted with her vision of efficient, merit-based government. The great aristocratic families who dominated court life had their own interests and traditions, their own understanding of honor and proper behavior that didn't always align with the Empress's desire for rational administration. Yet even as she navigated these political complexities, Catherine never lost her appreciation for culture and beauty, for the arts and sciences that she believed elevated human civilization above mere survival and struggle. The Hermitage continued to grow, acquiring masterpieces that would make it one of Europe's greatest museums. The Academy of Sciences flourished under her patronage, attracting scholars from across the continent to contribute to Russian learning and advancement. Architecture remained one of Catherine's great passions, and during these mature years of her reign, she oversaw the construction of some of Russia's most magnificent buildings. The Cameron Gallery at Tsarskoye Selo, the Marble Palace in St. Petersburg, the expansion of the Winter Palace itself, all bore witness to her vision of Russia as a great European power deserving of monuments that would rival anything in Paris or Vienna. But perhaps most revealing of Catherine's evolution as a ruler was her approach to religious and cultural diversity within the empire. Early in her reign, she had been primarily concerned with consolidating power and establishing her legitimacy. Now, with her position secure and her achievements recognized across Europe, she could afford to take a more nuanced approach to governing the many different peoples who lived under Russian rule. The Empress issued edicts protecting the rights of Muslims in the Crimea and the Caucasus, recognizing that forced conversion would only breed resentment and rebellion. She granted privileges to Jewish communities, allowing them to establish schools and maintain their religious practices despite centuries of persecution and restriction. German colonists were encouraged to settle in southern Russia, bringing with them agricultural techniques and commercial skills that would benefit the entire region. These policies reflected both political wisdom and genuine tolerance, but they also revealed Catherine's growing understanding that the strength of the Russian Empire lay not in the uniformity of its people, but in their diversity. Properly managed and directed toward common goals, the German princess, who had become a Russian empress, had learned that identity itself was fluid, that loyalty could be earned and maintained through just treatment rather than imposed through force and fear. As Catherine entered the final decade of her reign, she found herself increasingly drawn to reflection on the nature of power, legacy, and the meaning of a life spent in service to an empire that spanned continents. The woman who had once seized a throne through courage and cunning now faced the more subtle challenge of ensuring that her life's work would survive her death and continue to benefit the people she had sworn to serve. The question of succession weighed heavily on her mind during these years. Her son Paul, who would inherit the throne by right of birth, represented everything she had struggled against during her own rise to power. Where she had embraced Enlightenment ideals and European culture, Paul seemed drawn to rigid militarism and autocratic tradition. Where she had sought to balance competing interests through careful diplomacy and compromise, Paul appeared to prefer simple commands backed by force. Catherine had hoped that her grandson Alexander might prove a more suitable heir to her legacy, and she spent considerable effort on his education, ensuring that he was exposed to the same philosophical and cultural influences that had shaped her own development. Yet she also understood that each generation must find its own path, that the Russia she had known and shaped would inevitably change under new leadership. The Empress began to spend more time reviewing her accomplishments and considering how best to preserve them for future generations. The legal code she had worked on for so many years remained incomplete, but its principles had influenced countless smaller reforms and administrative improvements. The territorial expansion of the empire had brought new resources and new opportunities, but also new responsibilities and new challenges for those who would follow her. In her private chambers, surrounded by portraits of the philosophers and artists who had influenced her thinking, Catherine would often reflect on the paradoxes that had defined her reign. She had sought to be an enlightened monarch, yet had been forced to use methods that contradicted enlightened principles. She had wanted to improve the lives of her subjects, yet had been unable to abolish the system of serfdom that kept millions in bondage. She had dreamed of ruling through reason and law, yet had discovered that power ultimately rested on force and the willingness to use it. These contradictions did not fill her with despair or regret, but rather with a deeper understanding of the complexities inherent in any attempt to govern human affairs. The young woman who had once believed that good intentions and rational policies were sufficient to transform society had learned that change comes slowly, that it requires not just vision, but patience, not just idealism, but pragmatism. Catherine's correspondence during these final years revealed a woman who had found peace with the limitations of her achievements while remaining proud of what she had accomplished. To foreign visitors, she spoke with satisfaction of Russia's emergence as a major European power, of the cultural flowering that had occurred during her reign, of the administrative reforms that had made the empire more efficient and just. But in her private moments, she acknowledged the work that remained undone, the problems that would challenge her successors, the gap between aspiration and achievement that characterizes all human endeavor. The Empress continued to work with the same dedication that had marked her entire reign, reviewing documents, meeting with ministers, and making the countless small decisions that kept the vast machinery of empire functioning. But she also made time for the simple pleasures that had sustained her through decades of struggle and responsibility. Reading in her library, walking in her gardens, corresponding with old friends, and enjoying the company of the few people who knew her not as an empress, but as a woman who had dedicated her life to service and duty. As winter approached in the final years of the 18th century, Catherine could look back on a reign that had transformed not just Russia, but the very concept of enlightened monarchy. She had shown that a foreign-born woman could successfully rule one of Europe's great powers, that philosophical principles could influence practical politics, that reform was possible even within the constraints of autocratic government. Her legacy would be debated by historians for centuries to come, but there could be no doubt that she had left Russia stronger, more cultured, and more respected than she had found it. In the quiet moments before sleep, as the great palace settled into its nightly rest and the vast empire continued its ancient rhythms under the winter stars, Catherine would sometimes remember the young German princess who had first set foot on Russian soil so many decades ago. That girl's dreams of glory and transformation had been realized beyond any reasonable expectation, but in ways that could never have been anticipated. The journey from Sophie Augusta Friederike to Catherine the Great had been one of continuous learning, adaptation, and growth, marked by triumphs and failures, wisdom and mistakes, all woven together into a tapestry of human experience that reflected the complexities of power and the eternal challenge of governing wisely and well. The weight of the crown had grown heavier with each passing year, but Catherine had learned to bear it with grace, understanding that true greatness lay not in the absence of burden, but in the willingness to accept responsibility for the welfare of millions, to make difficult decisions with incomplete information, and to persevere in the face of obstacles that would have defeated lesser souls. As she prepared to pass that burden to others, she could rest assured that she had fulfilled her duty to the best of her ability, leaving behind a legacy that would endure long after her own voice had been silenced by the passage of time. Wisdom, the weight of years, began to settle upon Catherine's shoulders, like the heavy ermine of her ceremonial robes. The woman who had seized power at 33 now approached her 67th year, and though her mind remained as sharp as the finest Damascus steel, her body whispered the quiet truths that all mortals must eventually hear. The morning light that filtered through the tall windows of the Winter Palace seemed gentler now, as if time itself had learned to treat the aging empress with the reverence she had earned through decades of tireless service to her adopted homeland. Catherine rose each day before dawn, as had been her custom for over 30 years, but the ritual had taken on a different quality. No longer the eager anticipation of a young ruler hungry to transform the world, but the steady determination of a master craftsman putting finishing touches on her life's greatest work. In the grand halls where she had once stridden with the confidence of youth, Catherine now moved with the measured pace of accumulated wisdom. Her ladies-in-waiting noticed how she would pause sometimes at the great portraits lining the corridors. Images of Peter the Great, of Elizabeth, of the long line of Romanov rulers who had preceded her. In these moments, she seemed to be conducting silent conversations with the ghosts of Russia's past, as if seeking their counsel on how to prepare her vast empire for the uncertainties that would follow her departure from this world. The diplomatic dispatches that arrived daily from across Europe carried news of revolution and upheaval that made Catherine's blood run cold. The French monarchy, that glittering symbol of absolute power that had once been her model and rival, had fallen to the fury of its own people. The execution of Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette sent shockwaves through every royal court in Europe, and Catherine felt each tremor as a personal warning. The age of unquestioned royal authority was ending, and she knew that the Russia she would leave behind must be strong enough to weather the storms of change that were sweeping across the continent. In response to these threats, Catherine's policies became more conservative, more focused on preserving the stability she had worked so hard to create. The liberal ideals that had once fired her imagination now seemed dangerous luxuries in a world where common people dared to drag their sovereign rulers to the guillotine. She restricted travel abroad for Russian nobles, fearing they might return, contaminated with revolutionary ideas. Books and pamphlets that spoke of liberty and equality were banned, and Catherine's secret police kept careful watch for any signs of seditious thinking among her subjects. Yet even as she tightened her grip on the reins of power, Catherine could not shake the feeling that the world was changing in ways that no single ruler, however great, could control. The Enlightenment ideals she had once embraced with such enthusiasm had taken on a life of their own, spreading like wildfire through the minds of men and women who no longer accepted that their betters had been chosen by God to rule over them. Catherine understood that she was witnessing the end of an era, and that the absolute monarchy she had perfected might not survive long after her death. This awareness lent a sense of urgency to her remaining years. Catherine threw herself into projects that would ensure her legacy would endure, even if the political system she had mastered did not. She devoted increasing attention to the Hermitage, her private collection of art and artifacts that had grown into one of the world's greatest repositories of human culture. Each new acquisition was chosen not merely for its beauty or rarity, but for its ability to educate and inspire future generations of Russians who might never have the opportunity to travel to the great capitals of Europe. The Empress also turned her attention to the written word, understanding that ideas and knowledge were the most durable monuments any ruler could leave behind. She continued her correspondence with Voltaire's successors, though the tone of these letters had grown more philosophical, more concerned with eternal questions than immediate political problems. Catherine began work on her memoirs, setting down in her own words the story of how a German princess had become the greatest ruler in Russian history. These writings revealed a woman of remarkable self-awareness, capable of acknowledging her mistakes while taking justified pride in her achievements. In the realm of law and administration, Catherine worked tirelessly to complete the reforms she had begun decades earlier. The legal code she had spent so many years developing was refined and expanded, creating a system of justice that would serve Russia long after her death. She established new schools and universities, understanding that an educated population would be better equipped to preserve the prosperity and stability she had built. The mining and manufacturing industries she had fostered continued to grow, creating wealth that would strengthen Russia against future challenges. As Catherine's hair turned silver and her steps grew more deliberate, the question that haunted every absolute monarch pressed upon her with increasing urgency. Who would inherit the vast empire she had spent a lifetime building? Her relationship with her son Paul had never been easy, and the passage of years had done little to bridge the gulf between mother and heir. Paul, now in his 40s, remained bitter about his long exclusion from meaningful participation in government, and Catherine saw in him none of the qualities she believed essential for successful rule. Where Catherine was diplomatic and subtle, Paul was blunt and often tactless. Where she had learned to work within the complex web of court politics, he seemed determined to sweep away all existing arrangements and impose his will through force. Most troubling of all, Paul had developed an admiration for Prussian military discipline that reminded Catherine uncomfortably of her late husband Peter III, whose brief reign had nearly destroyed everything Elizabeth had built. Catherine considered various alternatives to the traditional succession, including the possibility of bypassing Paul in favor of her grandson Alexander, a young man who showed far more promise as a future ruler. Alexander had been educated according to Catherine's own progressive principles, and she saw in him a continuation of her own values and vision for Russia. However, changing the succession would require either Paul's consent or his removal, and Catherine was reluctant to plunge Russia into the kind of dynastic crisis that had plagued the empire earlier in the century. Instead, she focused on preparing detailed instructions for whoever would succeed her, documents that would guide future rulers in maintaining the policies and principles that had made her reign so successful. Catherine also worked to surround Paul with advisors who shared her vision for Russia, hoping that wise counselors might moderate his more extreme impulses once he assumed power. She promoted men like Alexander Bezborodko and Alexei Arakcheyev, trusted servants who had proved their loyalty and competence during her own reign. The Empress also devoted considerable attention to her grandson's education, particularly that of Alexander and his brother Constantine. She personally oversaw their tutoring, ensuring they learned not only the traditional subjects of royal education, languages, mathematics, history, but also the practical skills of statecraft that would serve them well as future rulers. Catherine wanted them to understand that kingship was not a privilege to be enjoyed, but a responsibility to be shouldered, a burden that required wisdom, patience, and an unwavering commitment to the welfare of their subjects. In her private moments, Catherine sometimes wondered whether the age of absolute monarchy was drawing to a close, and whether her grandsons might find themselves ruling a very different kind of state than the one she had known. The revolutionary fires burning in France, and spreading across Europe suggested that the relationship between rulers and ruled was changing in fundamental ways. Catherine hoped that the strong institutions she had built would allow Russia to adapt to these changes without losing the stability and prosperity that had become the hallmarks of her reign. Even as her body began to show the inevitable signs of age, Catherine's mind remained as active and innovative as ever. She recognized that her remaining years represented a precious opportunity to complete the great work of transformation she had begun so many decades earlier. With the wisdom that comes only from long experience, she focused her energy on those reforms that would have the most lasting impact on Russian society. One of her primary concerns was the condition of Russia's urban centers, which had grown rapidly during her reign, but often lacked the infrastructure necessary to support their expanding populations. Catherine initiated ambitious projects to improve sanitation, water supply, and public health in cities across the empire. She understood that healthy, prosperous cities would serve as engines of continued economic growth and cultural development, and that investment in urban infrastructure would pay dividends for generations to come. The Empress also turned her attention to the relationship between the state and the Orthodox Church, an institution that wielded enormous influence over the daily lives of her subjects. While Catherine had always been careful to show proper respect for religious traditions, she believed that the Church's vast landholdings and exemption from taxation placed an unfair burden on the rest of society. Through a series of carefully negotiated agreements, she brought much church property under state control, while compensating the clergy with salaries and pensions that provided them with greater financial security. In the realm of commerce and trade, Catherine worked to eliminate the remaining barriers that hindered economic development. She simplified the tax system, reduced the bureaucratic obstacles facing merchants and manufacturers, and negotiated new trade agreements with foreign powers that opened new markets for Russian goods. The Empress understood that economic prosperity was the foundation upon which all other achievements rested, and that a wealthy Russia would be better equipped to defend itself against external threats and internal instability. Catherine also devoted considerable attention to the development of Russia's southern regions, territories that had been conquered during her wars with the Ottoman Empire, but remained sparsely populated and underdeveloped. She offered generous incentives to encourage settlement, including grants of land, exemption from taxes, and religious freedom for immigrants willing to make their homes in these frontier regions. Under her guidance, cities like Kherson and Sebastopol were transformed from military outposts into thriving commercial centers that served as gateways between Russia and the wider world. The question of serfdom continued to weigh heavily on Catherine's conscience, even though she had long since abandoned her early hopes of abolishing the institution entirely. While she could not free the millions of peasants bound to their noble masters without risking civil war, she did implement reforms that improved their legal status and provided some protection against the worst abuses. Serfs were granted the right to appeal mistreatment by their owners, and nobles who were found guilty of excessive cruelty could have their estates confiscated by the state. Perhaps most importantly, Catherine established schools and educational programs specifically designed to prepare a new generation of administrators and officials who would be capable of governing the empire according to rational, enlightened principles. She understood that lasting reform required not just good laws, but competent people to implement them, and that the quality of government depended ultimately on the quality of those who served in it. By the mid-1790s, Catherine could no longer ignore the whispers of mortality that had begun to sound more insistently in her daily life. The woman who had once danced until dawn at court balls now tired more easily, and the hands that had signed thousands of decrees and diplomatic treaties sometimes trembled slightly as she wrote. Her physicians, the finest doctors available in all of Europe, spoke in carefully measured tones about the importance of rest and moderation. But Catherine had never been a woman to accept limitations easily. The death of old friends and trusted advisors served as unwelcome reminders of the passage of time. Grigory Potemkin's death in 1791 had left a void in Catherine's life that no one else could fill, and the loss of other long-time companions created an increasing sense of isolation. The court that had once been filled with vibrant personalities who challenged and stimulated her thinking gradually became populated by younger faces who knew her only as the aging autocrat, not as the passionate reformer she had once been. Catherine found solace in her correspondence with intellectuals and philosophers across Europe, relationships that provided her with the kind of stimulating conversation that was increasingly rare at court. Through her letters, she continued to engage with the great questions of her age: the proper relationship between liberty and order, the role of reason in human affairs, the possibility of progress and reform. These exchanges reminded her that her influence extended far beyond the borders of Russia, and that the ideas she had championed would continue to inspire future generations long after her death. The Empress also drew comfort from her artistic and cultural projects, particularly the continuing expansion of the Hermitage collection. Each new masterpiece that arrived in St. Petersburg represented not just an addition to Russia's cultural treasures, but a victory over time itself, a way of preserving beauty and meaning that would outlast the political upheavals and social changes that were reshaping the world. Catherine often spent quiet evenings walking through the galleries she had created, surrounded by paintings and sculptures that connected her to the greatest achievements of human civilization. Her relationship with her grandsons became increasingly important as Catherine contemplated the future of her dynasty. She delighted in their company, finding in their youthful energy and curiosity an echo of her own passionate engagement with life. Through them, she could see the possibility that her values and vision might survive even if the specific institutions she had created did not. Catherine worked to instill in Alexander and Constantine not just the skills they would need as rulers, but the moral principles that had guided her own reign: a commitment to justice, a respect for learning, and an understanding that true greatness lay in service to others. As the revolutionary fervor in France reached new heights of violence and extremism, Catherine felt a growing sense of urgency about securing Russia against similar upheavals. She increased funding for the secret police and tightened controls on the movement of people and ideas across Russia's borders. At the same time, she worked to address some of the grievances that might fuel popular discontent, improving conditions for urban workers and providing more opportunities for advancement within the military and civil service. The Empress understood that her greatest protection against revolution lay not in repression, but in the prosperity and stability she had brought to Russian society. The nobility supported her because she had confirmed their privileges while also providing them with opportunities for wealth and advancement. The merchant classes flourished under her policies of economic development and trade expansion. Even the common people, though still bound by the constraints of serfdom, enjoyed greater security and prosperity than their parents had known. The autumn of 1796 arrived with unusual mildness, as if nature itself was reluctant to herald the approaching winter. Catherine maintained her daily routines with characteristic determination, rising early to review state papers and receiving ministers and ambassadors as she had done for over 3 decades. Those closest to her noticed that she seemed more reflective than usual, often pausing in conversation to gaze out the windows at the Neva River, where the first traces of ice were beginning to form along the banks. On the morning of November 1796, Catherine arose before dawn as was her custom and made her way to her private study. The servants who brought her morning tea found her already dressed and seated at her writing desk, working on a letter to one of her correspondents. In Vienna, she seemed in good spirits, discussing plans for upcoming court entertainments and expressing satisfaction with reports she had received about the harvest in the southern provinces. The Empress spent the morning in meetings with her ministers, reviewing preparations for the coming winter and discussing the allocation of resources to various government departments. She was particularly concerned about ensuring adequate supplies of food and fuel for the capital's residents, remembering how shortages had contributed to unrest in other European cities. Catherine's attention to such practical details reflected her understanding that successful government required not just grand vision, but careful attention to the mundane necessities that kept society functioning. After lunch, Catherine retired to her private apartments for a brief rest, another concession to her advancing years that she had only recently begun to make. She used this time to review her personal correspondence and to work on her memoirs, the literary project that had become increasingly important to her as a way of ensuring that future generations would understand her motivations and achievements. The pages she wrote during these quiet hours revealed a woman of remarkable self-awareness, capable of acknowledging her failures while taking justified pride in her successes. The afternoon brought a series of audiences with foreign diplomats and provincial officials, meetings that Catherine conducted with the same attention to detail and diplomatic skill that had characterized her reign. She was particularly interested in reports from her governors about conditions in distant parts of the empire, understanding that effective rule required accurate information about developments far from the capital. Even in her final months, Catherine remained committed to the principle that an autocrat who lost touch with the reality of her subjects' lives would inevitably lose their loyalty and respect. As evening approached, Catherine dismissed her official duties and spent time with her grandsons, listening to their lessons and discussing their plans for the future. These conversations brought her great joy, as she saw in their enthusiasm and intelligence the hope that her work would continue long after her death. Alexander, in particular, showed the kind of thoughtful engagement with serious questions that convinced Catherine he might one day become a truly great ruler. The Empress retired to her chambers that evening with no indication that this night would be different from thousands of others. She read for a while, as was her custom, choosing a volume of philosophy that continued her lifelong engagement with the great questions of human existence. Her ladies-in-waiting reported that she seemed peaceful and content, expressing satisfaction with the day's accomplishments and making plans for the following week's activities. November 17, 1796, began like any other day in the Winter Palace, with servants moving quietly through the corridors in preparation for the Empress's morning routine. But when Catherine's personal attendants entered her chambers at the usual hour, they found their sovereign had suffered a stroke during the night. She lingered for several hours, surrounded by her family and closest advisors, but never regained consciousness. As the afternoon light faded over St. Petersburg, Catherine the Great drew her final breath, ending a reign that had transformed Russia and established her as one of history's most remarkable rulers. News of the Empress's death spread quickly through the capital and then across the vast expanse of the Russian Empire. In St. Petersburg, the nobility gathered in solemn assemblies to pay their respects to the woman who had elevated their status while demanding their service. Merchants and craftsmen closed their shops as a mark of respect for the ruler who had brought prosperity to their trades. Even among the common people, many of whom had known no other sovereign during their lifetimes, there was a genuine sense of loss for the Empress, who had brought order and stability to their world. Foreign diplomats rushed to send dispatches to their home governments, recognizing that Catherine's death marked the end of an era in European politics. The courts of Vienna, Berlin, and London had grown accustomed to dealing with a Russian ruler who combined intellectual sophistication with shrewd political judgment, and they wondered whether her successors would maintain the same level of diplomatic skill and cultural refinement. The Ottoman Empire, which had suffered so many defeats at Catherine's hands, received the news with a mixture of relief and uncertainty about what the future might bring. The immediate challenge of succession was resolved quickly, and without the kind of palace revolution that had plagued Russia earlier in the century. Paul, despite his complex relationship with his mother, assumed the throne as had always been intended, and the machinery of government continued to function smoothly. This peaceful transition was perhaps Catherine's final gift to her adopted homeland, the creation of institutions strong enough to survive the death of even the most dominant ruler. Catherine's funeral was a magnificent affair that reflected both her imperial dignity and her personal taste for grandeur. Her body lay in state in the Cathedral of Saints Peter and Paul, where thousands of subjects filed past to pay their final respects. The ceremony itself combined Orthodox tradition with elements that reflected Catherine's cosmopolitan outlook, including musical selections from European composers she had patronized during her lifetime. The inventory of Catherine's personal effects revealed the remarkable breadth of her interests and the depth of her learning. Her private library contained thousands of volumes in Russian, French, German, and English, with extensive annotations in her own hand that demonstrated her active engagement with the ideas of her age. Her correspondence, carefully preserved and organized, provided a detailed record of her relationships with the leading intellectuals, artists, and political figures of 18th century Europe. Perhaps most significantly, the governmental institutions Catherine had created continued to function effectively after her death, demonstrating that her reforms had created genuine improvements in Russian administration, rather than merely reflecting her personal influence. The educational system she had established continued to produce trained officials and military officers. The legal code she had developed provided a framework for justice that served Russia well into the 19th century. The economic policies she had implemented continued to generate prosperity and growth. Paul's assumption of power brought immediate changes that highlighted both the extent of Catherine's influence and the fragility of some of her achievements. The new emperor, driven by years of resentment and a desire to establish his own authority, began systematically reversing many of his mother's policies. The noble privileges that Catherine had carefully balanced with service obligations were modified, creating tension between the crown and the aristocracy that Catherine had worked so hard to avoid. Paul's fascination with Prussian military discipline led to changes in the Russian army that many officers found unnecessarily harsh and foreign to Russian traditions. The relatively relaxed atmosphere of Catherine's court gave way to a more rigid protocol that emphasized the emperor's absolute authority rather than the collaborative approach Catherine had perfected. These changes created uncertainty among the nobility and foreign observers about the future direction of Russian policy. However, the fundamental structures Catherine had created proved more durable than some of her specific policies. The administrative system she had established continued to function effectively, staffed by competent officials who had been trained according to her principles of rational government. The educational institutions she had founded continued to produce the skilled personnel needed to govern a modern state. The economic development she had fostered provided Russia with the resources necessary to maintain its position as a major European power. In the realm of culture and intellectual life, Catherine's influence proved particularly enduring. The Hermitage collection she had assembled became a permanent treasure of world civilization, inspiring Russian artists and scholars while demonstrating to foreign visitors the sophistication of Russian culture. The writers, architects, and musicians she had patronized established traditions that continued to flourish long after her death, contributing to Russia's emergence as a major cultural force in European civilization. The territorial gains Catherine had achieved through her military campaigns remained integral parts of the Russian Empire, bringing new populations and resources under Russian control. The cities she had founded in the south, particularly in Crimea and along the Black Sea coast, continued to grow and prosper, serving as gateways for Russian trade and cultural exchange with the Ottoman Empire and the Mediterranean world. Catherine's foreign policy legacy also proved remarkably durable. The alliances she had forged and the diplomatic principles she had established continued to guide Russian international relations well into the 19th century. Her success in establishing Russia as an equal partner with the traditional powers of Western Europe created a foundation that her successors built upon, even when they modified her specific approaches to particular problems. The question of serfdom, which had troubled Catherine throughout her reign, remained unresolved and would continue to plague Russian society for decades to come. However, the legal protections she had established for serfs and the economic opportunities she had created for other social classes provided a foundation for future reforms. The education system she had developed helped create a class of administrators and intellectuals who would eventually play crucial roles in abolishing serfdom and modernizing Russian society. In the years immediately following Catherine's death, as the shock of her passing gave way to historical reflection, the true magnitude of her achievements began to emerge more clearly. Scholars and political observers, both Russian and foreign, recognized that her reign represented a watershed moment in Russian history. The transformation of a relatively backward state into a major European power that could compete with France, Austria, and Britain on equal terms. The memoirs and diaries published by those who had known Catherine personally revealed the complexity of her character and the sophistication of her political skills. Foreign ambassadors wrote of her remarkable ability to combine intellectual discourse with shrewd negotiation, while Russian nobles recalled her talent for inspiring loyalty while demanding competent service. These first-hand accounts helped establish Catherine's reputation not just as a successful ruler, but as one of the most fascinating personalities of her age. Historians began to recognize that Catherine's reign represented the culmination of the modernization process that Peter the Great had begun nearly a century earlier. Where Peter had used force and dramatic gestures to drag Russia into the modern world, Catherine had achieved similar results through more subtle methods that built upon existing institutions rather than destroying them. Her approach proved more durable because it created genuine changes in Russian society, rather than merely imposing foreign models upon unwilling subjects. The artistic and cultural achievements of Catherine's reign also gained increasing recognition as time passed. The architectural projects she had commissioned, particularly the expansion of the Winter Palace and the creation of new urban centers, established aesthetic standards that influenced Russian design for generations. The literary works produced during her reign, including her own writings, demonstrated that Russian culture had achieved a level of sophistication comparable to that of Western Europe. Catherine's influence on European political thought also became more apparent as the revolutionary upheavals of the early 19th century unfolded. Her demonstration that Enlightened principles could be successfully combined with effective government provided an alternative model to both the absolute monarchy of the old regime and the radical democracy of the French Revolution. Political theorists across Europe studied her methods as they sought ways to reform their own societies without triggering violent upheaval. The economic development Catherine had fostered continued to transform Russian society long after her death. The merchant classes she had encouraged grew in wealth and influence, creating a middle class that would play an increasingly important role in Russian politics and culture. The industrial development she had initiated provided the foundation for Russia's emergence as a major manufacturing power in the 19th century. Perhaps most importantly, Catherine's reign established Russia's reputation as a culturally sophisticated nation capable of contributing to European civilization, rather than merely borrowing from it. The scholars, artists, and writers who flourished under her patronage proved that Russians could excel in intellectual and creative pursuits, challenging Western European assumptions about their cultural inferiority. The true measure of Catherine's achievements became apparent during the Napoleonic Wars, when the institutions she had built and the society she had shaped faced their greatest test. The Russian Empire that confronted Napoleon's Grande Armée was far stronger and more resilient than the state Catherine had inherited in 1762, and its ultimate victory demonstrated the effectiveness of her reforms and the durability of her legacy. The military that fought at Austerlitz, Borodino, and Leipzig was organized according to principles Catherine had established, combining traditional Russian courage with the professional training and modern equipment she had provided. The officers who led these forces had been educated in the schools she had founded, while the administrative system that supported the war effort reflected the rational organization she had implemented. The financial resources that sustained Russia through years of costly warfare came from the economic development she had fostered. More fundamentally, the patriotic spirit that inspired Russian resistance to foreign invasion reflected the sense of national identity that Catherine had helped create. Under her guidance, Russia had developed a cultural confidence that allowed its people to resist Napoleon's claims to represent a superior civilization. The writers, artists, and intellectuals who rallied Russian opinion against the French invasion were products of the educational and cultural institutions Catherine had established. The diplomatic skills that enabled Russia to forge the coalitions that ultimately defeated Napoleon also reflected Catherine's legacy. The network of alliances and the reputation for reliability that she had built provided the foundation for the international cooperation that proved essential to victory. Russian diplomats drew upon the experience and traditions established during Catherine's reign as they navigated the complex negotiations that shaped the post-Napoleonic settlement. The territorial gains that resulted from Napoleon's defeat, including the acquisition of Finland and much of Poland, vindicated Catherine's strategy of expanding Russian influence westward while maintaining the empire's traditional interests in the south and east. These additions to Russian territory provided both strategic security and economic resources that strengthened the empire throughout the 19th century. Perhaps most significantly, Russia's emergence as the dominant power in post-Napoleonic Europe fulfilled Catherine's vision of her adopted homeland as a major force in world affairs. The Congress of Vienna and the Holy Alliance that followed represented the culmination of the process Catherine had begun. The establishment of Russia as an equal partner with the traditional powers of Western Europe in shaping international order. The social and economic changes that accompanied Russia's victory also reflected Catherine's influence. The liberation campaigns that carried Russian armies across Europe exposed Russian officers and soldiers to new ideas and experiences that accelerated the modernization of Russian society. The economic benefits of victory provided resources for further development of the infrastructure and institutions Catherine had established. As the 19th century progressed and Russia continued to evolve, the depth and durability of Catherine's influence became increasingly apparent. The great reforms of Alexander II, including the abolition of serfdom, built upon foundations she had laid and reflected principles she had advocated. The legal framework she had established provided the basis for a more humane and rational system of justice, while the educational institutions she had founded produced the administrators and intellectuals who guided Russia's continued modernization. The economic development Catherine had initiated accelerated throughout the 19th century, transforming Russia from a primarily agricultural society into a major industrial power. The transportation networks she had begun were expanded into a comprehensive system of roads, canals, and railways that connected the vast expanses of the empire. The cities she had founded grew into major commercial and cultural centers that rivaled the great metropolises of Western Europe. In the realm of culture and intellectual life, Catherine's impact proved particularly enduring. The tradition of literary excellence she had fostered reached its pinnacle in the works of Pushkin, Tolstoy, and Dostoevsky, writers who drew inspiration from the cultural confidence Catherine had helped establish. The scientific and philosophical investigation she had encouraged continued to flourish, contributing to humanity's understanding of the natural world and the human condition. Catherine's influence extended beyond Russia's borders as well, shaping European political thought and serving as a model for rulers who sought to combine effective government with enlightened principles. Her correspondence with philosophers and intellectuals across Europe had helped spread ideas about rational administration and progressive reform that influenced political development throughout the continent. The example she had set of a female ruler succeeding in a traditionally masculine sphere inspired women in many different contexts to challenge conventional limitations on their roles in society. The architectural and artistic heritage Catherine had created continued to inspire and educate future generations. The palaces, parks, and public buildings she had commissioned served not only as symbols of imperial grandeur, but as spaces where Russian society could develop its own cultural traditions. The collections she had assembled provided scholars and artists with access to the treasures of world civilization, fostering the kind of cosmopolitan outlook that had characterized her own approach to governance. Perhaps most importantly, Catherine had demonstrated that political authority could be exercised in the service of human progress, rather than merely for personal aggrandizement. Her commitment to improving the lives of her subjects, even within the constraints of 18th century autocracy, established a standard of responsible leadership that influenced political development throughout Europe and beyond. The idea that rulers had obligations to their people, as well as rights over them, became increasingly accepted in the centuries following her death. The territorial legacy Catherine had created also proved remarkably durable. The borders she had established remained largely intact through the 19th and into the 20th century, providing Russia with the geographical foundation necessary to maintain its position as a major world power. The diversity of peoples and cultures within these borders created challenges for her successors, but also provided the human and material resources that enabled Russia to play a decisive role in world affairs. Even as the world Catherine had known passed into history, her influence continued to resonate through the centuries that followed. The Russian Revolution of 1917 swept away the monarchy she had served, but many of the institutions she had created adapted to new circumstances and continued to serve the Russian people under different forms of government. The educational system she had established provided the foundation for the development of Soviet science and technology, while the cultural traditions she had fostered helped Russian literature, music, and art maintain their distinctive character. Even under radically changed political conditions, the cities Catherine had founded continued to grow and prosper, becoming major centers of industry, commerce, and culture in the modern era. St. Petersburg, the capital she had adorned with magnificent palaces and cultural institutions, survived the devastation of World War II and the upheavals of political change to emerge as one of the world's great cultural centers. The Hermitage collection she had assembled remained one of humanity's greatest artistic treasures, inspiring millions of visitors and serving as a bridge between Russia and the wider world. Catherine's writings, particularly her correspondence and memoirs, continued to be studied by historians, political scientists, and students of leadership long after her death. Her insights into the challenges of governing a large and diverse society, her strategies for balancing competing interests, and her methods for implementing reform while maintaining stability, proved relevant to leaders facing similar challenges in very different historical contexts. The example Catherine had set as a female leader who succeeded in traditionally masculine domains continued to inspire women seeking to break through barriers in their own societies. Her demonstration that intellectual ability, political skill, and moral conviction were more important than gender in determining leadership effectiveness provided encouragement to women pursuing careers in politics, business, and other fields, where female participation had traditionally been limited. Modern scholars studying the development of the modern state have recognized Catherine's contributions to administrative science and public policy. Her systematic approach to legal reform, her methods for training and supervising government officials, and her strategies for managing economic development provided models that influenced political development in many different countries. The principles of rational administration and evidence-based policy that she pioneered became standard features of modern government. Catherine's approach to cultural policy also influenced modern thinking about the relationship between government and the arts. Her understanding that cultural development was both a source of national pride and a means of promoting social cohesion led her to establish institutions and provide patronage that served as models for cultural policy in many subsequent societies. The idea that government had a responsibility to support education, the arts, and scientific research became increasingly accepted in the centuries following her reign. Perhaps most significantly, Catherine had demonstrated that enlightened leadership could achieve remarkable results even within the constraints of existing political and social systems. Her success in implementing progressive reforms while maintaining political stability provided hope for those who believed that positive change was possible through peaceful means rather than revolutionary violence. This aspect of her legacy proved particularly relevant during periods of rapid social and political change, when societies sought ways to adapt to new circumstances without destroying the foundations of order and prosperity. The geographical areas Catherine had brought under Russian control remained strategically important well into the modern era, providing access to vital resources and trade routes that continued to influence international relations. The Black Sea ports she had secured gave Russia continued access to warm water shipping lanes, while the territories she had conquered in the south and west provided buffer zones that enhanced Russian security for centuries. As the world entered the 21st century, Catherine's legacy faced new challenges and opportunities. The collapse of the Soviet Union and the emergence of independent states in territories she had once governed created new political realities that required fresh thinking about the relationship between central authority and local autonomy. However, the cultural and economic foundations she had helped establish continued to influence development in these regions, providing continuity even amid dramatic political change. The increasing interconnectedness of the modern world also highlighted aspects of Catherine's legacy that had previously received less attention. Her commitment to international cultural exchange, her support for scientific investigation, and her belief in the importance of learning from other societies proved remarkably prescient in an era when global cooperation became essential for addressing common challenges. Through all these transformations, Catherine's fundamental insight remained relevant, that effective leadership required a combination of vision and pragmatism, idealism and realism, the ability to dream of a better future and the skill to make practical progress toward achieving it. This understanding of the complexities of leadership continued to provide guidance for those who sought to serve their societies constructively in very different circumstances than those Catherine had known. The study of Catherine's life and reign also continued to shed light on broader questions about the nature of political authority, the relationship between rulers and ruled, and the possibilities for human progress through institutional reform. Her successes and failures provided case studies that informed contemporary debates about governance, democracy, and the proper role of government in promoting social welfare and individual opportunity. As historians continue to examine her legacy, with the perspective that only time can provide, Catherine emerged not simply as a successful autocrat, but as a pioneering figure in the development of modern statecraft. Her methods for gathering information, analyzing problems, and implementing solutions established precedents that influenced administrative practice for centuries. Her understanding of the importance of communication between government and society, her recognition that legitimacy required results as well as tradition, and her insight that reform must be carefully planned and skillfully executed, remained relevant for leaders in democratic as well as autocratic systems. The lasting power of Catherine's example lay not in the specific institutions she had created or the particular policies she had implemented, but in the spirit of thoughtful, principled leadership she had embodied. Her commitment to learning from others while maintaining her own judgment, her ability to balance competing demands while pursuing long-term goals, and her understanding that true greatness lay in service to something larger than oneself provided. Inspiration for those who sought to make positive contributions to their societies, regardless of their formal positions or official authority. In the endless succession of seasons that followed her passing, as empires rose and fell, and the world transformed in ways she could never have imagined, Catherine's essential message endured: that human beings, guided by reason and motivated by compassion, possessed the capacity to create better societies, and more just institutions than those they had inherited. This faith in the possibility of progress through thoughtful action remained her greatest gift to posterity, a legacy more valuable than any territory conquered or any palace built, because it spoke to the eternal human aspiration to leave the world better than one found it. And so the German princess, who had traveled to Russia with little more than intelligence, ambition, and hope, had indeed achieved a form of immortality, not through the preservation of her physical monuments or the continuation of her political arrangements, but through the example she had set and the ideals she had embodied, in the courage of those who dared to challenge injustice, in the wisdom of those who sought to understand before acting, in the persistence of those who worked for gradual improvement rather than dramatic gesture. Something of Catherine's spirit lived on. The northern winds that swept across the vast expanse of Russia carried with them the whisper of her legacy, not the brittle echo of ancient glory, but the living promise that human wisdom, properly applied, could indeed transform the world. In the end, this was Catherine's true conquest. Not the territory she had added to maps, but the territory she had added to human possibility. Her empire of the spirit proved more durable than any earthly realm, because it was built not on force, but on the enduring human capacity for growth, learning, and hope. The stars that had witnessed her rise still wheeled overhead in their eternal dance, indifferent to the passage of emperors and the fall of dynasties. But in the quiet moments when the wind stilled and the world paused between one breath and the next, those who listened carefully might still hear the rustle of silk across polished floors, the scratch of a pen across parchment, the gentle voice of a woman who had dared to dream that reason and compassion might yet prevail over ignorance and cruelty. Catherine the Great had passed into legend, but legends, unlike empires, need not fall. They live in the spaces between words, in the silence, after the last note of music fades, in the moment when one soul recognizes in another the spark of something eternal and indestructible, and in that recognition, her true victory was complete. Not the triumph of armies or the accumulation of power, but the quiet conquest of one human heart, inspiring another to reach beyond what seemed possible toward what ought to be. The snow, fell softly on the winter palace, as it had for countless winters before, and would for countless winters hence. But now it fell on ground made sacred not by conquest, but by the patient labor of a woman who had understood that the greatest empire any ruler could build was the empire of human dignity, expanded one soul at a time, one reform at a time, one generation at a time, until the very idea of what it meant to govern and be governed was transformed forever. In the end, that was Catherine's gift to eternity. Not the memory of what was, but the promise of what could be. And in the endless turning of the seasons, in the ceaseless flow of time that levels all earthly things, that promise remained, patient as starlight, enduring as the human heart, eternal as the hope that tomorrow might yet be better than today.